Science, Mysticism, and the Destiny of Man. Episode 1. The Spark of Wonder. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was born on May 1st, 1881, in the chateau of Sassenat near Orsine, in the Auvergne region of France. He arrived into a world already brimming with tensions and possibilities, a world caught in the swirling cross-currents of tradition and modernization. France was still reeling from political upheavals of the late 19th century, grappling with questions of scientific progress, secularism, and the role of the Church. Into this environment, Teilhard was born as the fourth of 11 children in a devout Roman Catholic family. His father, Emmanuel, was an amateur naturalist with a deep fascination for the living world, while his mother, Berthe Adèle, hailed from a noble family whose ancestral lineage evoked a strong awareness of spiritual roots and aristocratic values. Together, they created a household where religious faith melded seamlessly with a keen curiosity about the natural environment. From his earliest recollections, Teilhard was aware of a kind of lure emanating from physical matter. While other children might collect bright pebbles with casual interest, his own collecting habits had more of a quasi-mystical undertone. He recounted in his letters and diaries that stones and minerals were not just inert masses to him. They somehow spoke of deep time, of a secret interiority that pulsed beneath their surfaces. His fascination would lead him to slip away from family gatherings to study the patterns and texture of rocks, hold them up to the light, and wonder why they shone or how they had come to be. In the late 19th century, Catholic families in rural France typically followed traditional forms of worship, passing on strict devotions and well-defined moral catechisms to their children. The world was divided, at least for many, into the sacred and the profane, with religion at the center of daily life. Yet Teilhard's father encouraged a spirit of inquiry that sat just a bit outside of strict conventional boundaries. Rather than dismissing evolutionary theories or scientific discoveries, Emmanuel would note new finds in biology or geology with curiosity, sometimes even enthusiastic fascination. The father's passion for natural history exposed young Pierre to volumes on geology, treatises on paleontology, and eventually the broad outlines of the emerging evolutionary perspective. In the late 19th century, Darwin's works and other evolutionary theories were stirring both controversy and excitement across Europe. The Church, especially in conservative circles, was cautious or even hostile to these notions, which seemed to conflict with a literal reading of Genesis. Yet, in the Teilhard household, curiosity was rarely dismissed. This interplay of faith and science in Pierre's childhood was not always harmonious. The Catholic Church had just endured a long struggle with the French state, as anti-clerical sentiments had grown since the Revolution. The era was marked by a cautious stance among clergy, who viewed modern scientific ideas as potentially corrosive to faith. Natural history, as an observational science, could be tolerated, but evolutionary claims that suggested humanity's descent from earlier life forms caused alarm. Many Catholic families preferred that children remain in a protective environment of catechetical instruction, trusting that the complexities of modern science would not challenge their beliefs if left at the door. Yet Emmanuel Teilhard's willingness to teach his children about fossils and geology meant that young Pierre's imagination took flight in a unique way. Early on, he started seeing no necessary contradiction between the wonders of God's creation and the revelations of science. If anything, each realm seemed to deepen the other. The natural world, with all its hidden processes, became for him a signpost pointing to greater divine mysteries. As he grew older, Teilhard developed a habit of blending fervent prayer with a nearly obsessive pursuit of nature's marvels. The fields around Sassenat were rich in volcanic formations, remnants of an ancient geological history that had shaped the Auvergne region. Pierre would climb the puys, the chain of extinct volcanoes that dotted the area, frequently stuffing his pockets with rock samples. When he returned home, he would label and categorize them, trying to piece together a picture of Earth's unfolding story. Contemplation for him was not merely an internal affair, but a communion with an evolving cosmos. The seeds of mysticism were planted in Teilhard's psyche well before formal theological training. Mysticism in the Christian tradition often emphasizes an inward encounter with God, seeing divinity permeating all aspects of existence. Meanwhile, the scientific worldview of the time was increasingly drawn to the outward aspects of matter, energy, and biological processes, searching for laws and patterns that might unify our understanding of the physical world. For young Pierre, the world of matter and the world of the spirit did not form two opposing poles, but rather a single continuum, a single reality. Stones, mountains, animals, humans, and God were woven together in a vast tapestry he longed to interpret. Though he was still a child, Pierre's reflective nature led him to keep rudimentary journals. He would record how he felt during long walks or how a certain color in the evening sky sparked a sense of awe. He described the quiet of the countryside at night, with the stars overhead, as a cosmic cathedral. Later, he would say that these early experiences constituted a kind of cosmic sense, an unspoken conviction that the universe was not static or random, but was alive with purpose, pointing toward greater unity and higher forms of consciousness. The late 1890s saw France in the midst of a renewed confrontation between state authorities and religious orders. A wave of secularism was sweeping the nation, culminating in laws that would eventually separate church and state in 1905. Many Catholic families were deeply distressed by these developments. The Jesuits, in particular, found themselves under intense pressure, and many Jesuit schools were closed. Despite these tensions, or perhaps because of them, the ardor for missionary work and religious life among certain devout young men actually increased. Teilhard, upon completing his secondary education, felt strongly called to the priesthood. Yet he was unsure how his burning interest in geology and biology could fit into that calling. Around him, many Catholic intellectuals still treated science and religion with a sense of mutual suspicion. But Teilhard saw a possibility that the two realms might illumine each other. In 1899, at the age of 18, Pierre took the significant step of entering the Jesuit novitiate in Aix-en-Provence. There, the daily rhythm was marked by prayer, study, work, and silence. Jesuit training was known for its rigor and intellectual thoroughness, requiring years of philosophical and theological preparation. Yet these studies did not stifle Teilhard's passion for the natural sciences. On the contrary, the Jesuit tradition had a deep respect for learning and critical thinking, dating back to its founder, Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Over the centuries, Jesuits had distinguished themselves as mathematicians, astronomers, geographers, linguists, and historians. The order's motto, Ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, was often interpreted to include the pursuit of scientific understanding, as it revealed the intricacies of God's creation. Young Teilhard thrived in this environment. He awakened early for meditation, spent hours reading spiritual treatises, and engaged in philosophical discussions with fellow novices. The community's library provided him access to more advanced geological and biological texts, which he devoured in his spare time. Despite his superiors' occasional raised eyebrows about some of the dangerous modern ideas swirling around evolution, they recognized Teilhard's intellectual gifts and did not wholly discourage his pursuits. The tension was there, of course. Church authorities generally maintained a cautious stance. While science could uncover truths about the physical world, it should not contradict or undermine dogmatic teachings. Teilhard, for his part, felt no desire to undermine any dogma. He was deeply devoted to the core tenets of Catholicism, especially the centrality of Christ in the story of human salvation. Yet he increasingly felt that the theory of evolution was describing a grand process by which God was continually creating and elevating the world, from simpler forms to complex consciousness. In his spiritual meditations, he envisioned Christ not merely as a distant savior, but as the ultimate point toward which the entire cosmos was converging. In the early 1900s, Teilhard took his vows in the Society of Jesus, an event that cemented his identity as a Jesuit. This was followed by a period of philosophical studies, usually 3 years, during which he delved deeper into metaphysics, ethics, and the official teachings of the Church. He began to shape, at least in embryonic form, the theological and philosophical synthesis that would later become his hallmark. He read St. Thomas Aquinas, appreciating the medieval theologian's efforts to integrate Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. At the same time, Teilhard read contemporary scientific works that expanded on Darwin's initial thesis. He realized that evolution was not just about biology. Geology and paleontology revealed an Earth billions of years old, with countless epochs of development culminating in the present. Chemistry and physics were unveiling the secrets of matter and energy, hinting that reality might be a single continuous fabric undergoing transformation over vast stretches of time. Throughout his novitiate and early studies, Teilhard never lost his childlike wonder at physical matter. He once described himself as in love with the world, seeing in each speck of dust the potential of a universe in gestation. If matter could become alive and life could become conscious, then consciousness might become spiritual, and the spiritual could become divine. This progression filled him with a sense of hope and purpose. He believed that the divine plan was not just about saving individual souls, but about guiding the entire cosmos toward a greater unity in Christ. This was, of course, a bold vision that stretched beyond the usual theological frameworks, but Teilhard had not yet encountered decisive opposition to it. For the moment, he nurtured these ideas privately, jotting them down in journals and shaping them in letters to close friends. By 1902, he was sent to teach at a Jesuit college, part of the normal rotation for Jesuits in training. Teaching young students natural science and religion, he realized that the youthful curiosity he had once felt in the fields of Auvergne now found echoes in his students' questions. They wondered about fossils, dinosaurs, and the age of the earth, but also about how that all fit with the Bible's account of creation. Teilhard began experimenting with ways of presenting evolutionary science as not contradictory to faith, but as revelatory of a deeper cosmic story. He would describe to his students how the fossil record showed the gradual appearance of life forms, how the complexities of living organisms suggested a directionality that might signify a divine intention. Though some colleagues worried that this might scandalize more conservative parents, Teilhard believed that students needed an honest approach, one that was neither dismissive of scientific facts nor reductively antagonistic to faith. Teilhard's own prayer life underwent a transformation during these years. His meditations on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius took on a cosmic dimension. Where the standard Jesuit retreat might dwell on Christ's life, death, and resurrection in a highly personal and intimate manner, Teilhard found himself imagining these mysteries playing out against the backdrop of an evolving universe. Christ's incarnation, for him, was the entrance of God, not only into human history, but into the entire cosmic process. The Eucharist, traditionally understood as the real presence of Christ under the appearances of bread and wine, took on an expanded significance, as a point where matter itself was transfigured, anticipating a future in which God would be all in all. This blending of Orthodox Catholic piety with evolutionary vistas hinted at the bold theological project he would eventually undertake in his major works. Outside the confines of the Jesuit community, scientific discovery marched on at a rapid pace. Paleontology was on the cusp of major breakthroughs, with new fossils being discovered in Africa and Asia that challenged old assumptions about the timeline of human origins. Teilhard kept abreast of these developments through journals and correspondence with fellow enthusiasts. He sensed that the emerging story of human evolution needed a metaphysical and theological interpretation, lest it remain purely materialistic in the popular imagination. He believed that, left to itself, an evolutionary worldview could degenerate into a nihilistic or reductionist perspective, seeing humans as mere accidents of blind forces. But if interpreted correctly, evolution could become a grand narrative of divine creativity, culminating in the appearance of reflective consciousness and destined to unite in Christ. In 1905, As the laws of secularization in France tightened, the Society of Jesus faced new restrictions. Like many of his fellow Jesuits, Teilhard was sent abroad for further studies. His travels would eventually take him to England, where he studied theology and natural science in a context somewhat more open to evolutionary ideas. Even within the English Catholic community, however, Darwinian evolution was still somewhat suspect, and official church statements from Rome maintained a careful distance from any unconditional endorsement of Darwin's theories. Teilhard proceeded cautiously, never wishing to violate church teaching, but his personal convictions continued to mature. In theological discussions, he would propose that perhaps God's way of creating was gradual, that the 6 days of Genesis might be interpreted allegorically, and that the fall of humanity described in the Bible was a spiritual event that did not necessarily conflict with the biological evidence of human origins. During these formative years, Teilhard underwent what he later called a conversion to the world, by which he meant a deeper realization that the material realm was fundamentally good and sacred, despite its imperfections. Medieval theology had made a clear distinction between the spiritual and material realms, often implying that the latter was lower in dignity. Teilhard wanted to reverse that polarity. Matter was not base or merely a temptation. Matter was the divine milieu in which consciousness would rise, culminating in a point of ultimate convergence he would later term the omega point. In subsequent decades, this concept would cause excitement and controversy in equal measure, but in his early life, it remained a private insight, something he tested in prayer and reflection. He pondered how the entire evolution of the cosmos, from the Big Bang, a concept not yet named or fully formulated in his day, but the notion of a beginning was on the horizon, to the development of stars and planets, and eventually to life on Earth, was a continuous movement toward more complex forms of organization and consciousness. By 1908, he was deep in his theological studies, nearing the time for his final ordination as a priest. He was keenly aware that he had to reconcile his Jesuit vocation with his scientific passion. The tension was not merely intellectual, it was also practical. How could he pursue paleontological research, which might require field expeditions and extensive time away, while fulfilling the expectations placed upon a Jesuit priest? Yet the Society of Jesus, for all its caution, also recognized Teilhard's special gifts. He was encouraged to delve deeper into scientific research, perhaps with an eye to teaching at Catholic institutions or contributing to a growing body of Jesuit scholarship in the sciences. Teilhard approached this future with a certain expectancy, believing that Providence had placed him on a path to bridge these two domains of knowledge. All the while, Teilhard's letters home to Auvergne showed that he retained a powerful attachment to the land of his birth. He wrote of the region's rocks and mountains as though they were old friends. He wrote of how, in his prayers, he would sometimes envision the layers of sediment under the church's altar, an invisible testament to the eons of Earth's history that lay beneath even the most sacred sites. This spiritual geological imagination would soon find more concrete expression in his fieldwork. In 1911, ordained a priest at age 30, Teilhard began to celebrate Mass, bringing to fruition years of spiritual and intellectual preparation. His first Mass was a simple affair, attended by fellow Jesuits rather than a large congregation. In his homily, Teilhard reflected on the notion that in offering the Eucharist, one also symbolically offered the entirety of creation back to God. It was an idea that would echo later in his writings, where he frequently spoke of the Mass on the world, imagining the whole universe as an altar. This was not a radical break from Catholic tradition. The idea that the Eucharist has cosmic significance had its roots in Eastern Christianity and certain Western mystics. But Teilhard's emphasis was singular. He wanted people to see that in the Eucharist, the evolutionary process itself was being sanctified, lifted up, and drawn forward toward a future fulfillment. Of course, he was still well aware that many in the ecclesiastical hierarchy found such language perplexing or even potentially heretical. The Church's official teachings at that time were very protective of the doctrine of original sin and the literal significance of Adam and Eve. Teilhard believed the theological truths about the fall could be preserved even if one accepted a long evolutionary process involving hominids. Yet he also recognized that the official position was not necessarily open to his imaginative synthesis. Out of humility and obedience, he largely kept his more speculative ideas to himself or shared them only with trusted colleagues and mentors. In these private circles, he tested the waters, gauging how far he might go in his attempts to unify Catholic doctrine and evolutionary theory. Reactions were mixed. Some found his ideas inspiring, sensing the potential for a grand reconciliation of faith and reason. Others worried he was overstepping the bounds of orthodoxy. As Teilhard approached his 30s, he experienced a growing desire to engage directly with the fossil record. His philosophical and theological convictions, especially concerning the progressive character of evolution, urged him to witness firsthand the evidence of ancient life. He wanted to see, in the strata of Earth, the tangible footprints of a divine plan unfolding through time. Around this period, he began to plan trips to examine fossil sites in Europe, though the scope of his journeys would soon expand far beyond the continent. In this sense, Teilhard's mysticism was of a very earthly kind. Rather than retreating into isolation or purely abstract contemplation, he wanted to put his hands in the dirt, to unearth relics of past epochs. In the swirl of dust and stone, he believed, lay clues to the cosmic story that God was writing. Christ, in evolution, became an unspoken mantra for him, a lens through which he interpreted both spiritual texts and geological data. His intellectual curiosity was matched by a physical stamina and a readiness for adventure that would serve him well in the field. Little did he know, however, that a global crisis was about to erupt: the Great War. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 would shatter Europe's illusions of progress and cast into question many beliefs, both secular and religious. For Teilhard, the war would be a crucible. He would serve as a stretcher-bearer in the trenches, witnessing unimaginable suffering. It would also become a defining period that tested and refined his theology of evolution, suffering, and redemption. Before that conflagration, however, he managed a few fruitful excursions into geological and paleontological research, gathering knowledge that would shape his future contributions. By this time, the Jesuit order recognized that Teilhard had a unique set of talents. Not only was he a devoted priest, but he was also a budding scientist with a clear aptitude for paleontology. He was given permission to undertake limited research trips, with the understanding that his primary allegiance remained with the Church. Teilhard's diaries reveal his excitement at each fossil discovery, his sense of awe when confronted with the deep antiquity of life on Earth. Each ancient bone or tooth was, for him, another hint that creation was a dynamic process, a story in which human beings occupied not just a random place, but a climactic role. Yet he was also aware of his fragile status in the Church, where many were quick to scrutinize anyone who appeared too sympathetic to evolutionary thought. He thus navigated his path carefully, blending piety, obedience, and scientific curiosity in a balancing act that was not always easy. He corresponded extensively with other Jesuits who shared his scientific bent, including those stationed in remote mission territories. Through these letters, Teilhard was gradually building a small network of Catholic scientists scattered across the globe, some of whom supported his vision of a more expansive theology. This network provided him with the reassurance that he was not alone in longing for a synthesis of faith and evolution. Nevertheless, most of these men proceeded with caution, well aware of the fate that had befallen others accused of modernism, a movement the Church had officially condemned in the early 20th century. Teilhard had no desire to align himself with any movement deemed heretical. He believed he was working within the tradition, seeking to expand it in legitimate ways. During the earliest years of his priesthood, Teilhard began formulating the outlines of a cosmological theology that would eventually find expression in his later works, especially the phenomenon of man. He envisioned a world in a state of becoming, pulled from ahead rather than pushed from behind, a universe striving toward higher consciousness, culminating in Christ, the omega point. This was not yet a fully articulated concept, but the seeds were there. Teilhard's experiences, from the fields of Auvergne to the libraries of Jesuit colleges, from the meditative stillness of the chapel to the excitement of scientific discovery, had converged to shape a young priest-scientist whose path was truly unique. By the time he reached his early 30s, Teilhard was on the cusp of the great conflicts and revelations that would define his life. The shadow of war loomed over Europe, but so did the promise of scientific breakthroughs that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of its origins. Teilhard stood ready, armed with a firm Catholic faith, a probing intellect, and a heart attuned to the mysteries of matter. He did not see the tension between creation and evolution as an irreconcilable chasm, but rather as an invitation to delve deeper into the divine plan. Looking back on these formative years, one can see how the core themes of his later thought took root: an unshakable belief in the sacredness of the evolving cosmos, a conviction that Christ stood at the very center and culmination of that cosmic process, and a desire to persuade his fellow believers that science and faith were not enemies but complementary lenses on a single profound reality. It was a bold stance to take, given the times. Yet Teilhard seemed driven by a force greater than caution, a force he identified with both the Jesuit ideal of service and a personal calling to illuminate the unity of creation. Thus, as the first episode of his life drew to a close, Teilhard de Chardin was a man poised between worlds. He was deeply embedded in the Catholic Church, with its centuries of tradition and its hierarchical caution. He was equally ensconced in the emerging scientific worldview, which promised insights into the origins of humanity and the immense timescales of planetary development. Rather than feeling torn, he felt inspired. He saw no reason these worlds should remain apart, and he devoted himself to forging links that might one day help others see what he saw: a universe charged with the grandeur of God, evolving toward ever greater consciousness and sanctified through the incarnation of Christ. The stage was set for a dramatic journey in which Teilhard would carry his integrative vision through the crucible of war, the challenges of ecclesiastical opposition, and the thrilling discoveries of modern science. The spark of wonder that illuminated his childhood days among the Auvergne hills was about to guide him through one of the most tumultuous periods in modern history, shaping a perspective that would eventually captivate the world through his landmark writings. Episode 2: Into the Furnace of War. When World War I erupted in the summer of 1914, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was 33 years old, recently ordained and eager to deepen his emerging synthesis of faith and evolutionary science through field research. He imagined that his future held the promise of geological expeditions and teaching posts, perhaps a quiet life of scholarship balanced by his priestly duties. The war, however, disrupted every ordinary plan. Young men across Europe found their lives turned upside down by a conflict that few had anticipated would be so prolonged or so devastating. Teilhard, compelled by both patriotic duty and ecclesiastical obedience, was soon drawn into the massive mobilization. Initially, he served as a stretcher-bearer in the 8th Moroccan Rifles, a role that demanded physical stamina and extraordinary courage. On the Western Front, these stretcher-bearers often operated in the exposed zones between trenches, risking their lives to rescue the wounded. Teilhard's letters from that time reveal a spirit both resolute and strangely elated. Though horror surrounded him, mud, barbed wire, the incessant thunder of artillery, he confessed to friends that he felt a rare kind of exaltation. In the midst of carnage, he sensed a burning conviction that the world, despite all appearances, was moving forward. He believed the war, cataclysmic though it was, would eventually catalyze a renewed sense of human unity. He had no illusions about the atrocities of modern warfare, yet he also perceived, behind the tumult, an evolutionary impetus driving humanity to confront its capacity for destruction and perhaps choose a more cohesive future. Teilhard's role in the trenches was complicated by his priestly identity. Surrounded by men, many of whom were close to despair, he offered not only medical assistance but also spiritual solace. He would pray with the wounded, administer last rites to the dying, and sometimes celebrate Mass on makeshift altars fashioned from ammunition crates. Even on the front lines, he carried with him a small selection of rocks and fossils, a silent testimony that the story of life on Earth was so much larger than the war raging around them. When the shelling relented, if only briefly, he might show a curious comrade a fossil fragment, explaining how it spoke of epochs long past, eons before human conflicts. These moments of shared wonder sometimes lifted men's spirits, reminding them of a broader perspective. The war's ferocity was a profound test of Teilhard's philosophical convictions. All around him lay evidence of the worst aspects of human nature: brutality, hatred, fear, desperation. Men who had once believed in the inevitability of progress now found themselves mired in a technologically sophisticated slaughter. Poison gas, machine guns, and massive artillery barrages suggested that science could be just as potent a tool for destruction as for enlightenment. Yet Teilhard was not shaken in his core belief that the cosmic process still marched forward, guided by divine providence. Instead, he set about interpreting the experience of war through the lens of what he would later call creative union. For him, human suffering and solidarity in the trenches were forging an unprecedented depth of collective consciousness. This was a theme he would revisit in his later writings, that from great trials, humanity could discover a deeper unity, a new sense of global interdependence. Whether that unity would emerge in a single leap was uncertain, but Teilhard believed the seeds for it were being planted, paradoxically, in the grim soil of the battlefields. During lulls between battles, Teilhard managed to keep up a semblance of academic reading and reflective writing. He composed essays and short notes that hinted at his evolving theological evolutionary synthesis. He had not yet refined all the ideas that would later appear in the phenomenon of man, but the basic lines were becoming clearer. He saw evolution as a sweeping process that encompassed the material, biological, and spiritual realms. Humanity's capacity for self-reflection, for conscious love, and for transcendence was not a chance development, but an essential phase in the cosmic story. He was convinced that Christ was the ultimate omega point, drawing the universe toward a final unity. One might expect that the brutal reality of war would crush such optimism, yet for Teilhard it seemed to spark an even fiercer resolve. The war, horrifying as it was, did not contradict an evolutionary worldview. Rather, it exposed the urgency of humanity's choice: either succumb to fragmentation and annihilation, or strive toward a unity born of shared suffering. Fellow soldiers often remarked on Teilhard's calm demeanor under fire. In one diary entry, a comrade described him as carrying wounded men through no man's land, with a look of inward focus, as if he was seeing something beyond the shells. This description became part of the lore surrounding Teilhard's wartime heroism. He was awarded several citations for bravery, including the Croix de Guerre, which recognized his selfless devotion in rescuing the injured under direct enemy fire. Part of what sustained him was his spiritual life. Each morning, before the day's chaos began, he would find a few moments of silence for prayer. Sometimes he would write short reflections, later published in letters, that read like mystical meditations on the mass of suffering. He interpreted the battlefield as a kind of cosmic altar where the sufferings of humanity were offered up. Though not yet fully understood or redeemed, they were not outside the trajectory of grace. When the war ended in 1918, Europe lay in ruins. Millions were dead, entire cities devastated, and the morale of a generation was shattered. Teilhard returned to a France deeply scarred by the conflict. Yet amid the rubble, he witnessed a certain longing for renewal, for a reimagining of European society. This cultural upheaval set the stage for Teilhard's post-war mission. If many intellectuals in Europe were veering toward existential despair, Teilhard felt an urgency to proclaim his vision of hope, a hope grounded in the belief that evolution continued unabated, that consciousness was rising and that Christ was still the guiding principle of the cosmic journey. Though the war had stunted his opportunities for extensive geological fieldwork, it had also shaped his theology in ways no academic setting could. He emerged from the trenches with a tempered, profound conviction that Christ was intimately bound up with the travails of the modern world, not standing aloof. This conviction led him to reflect more deeply on the relationship between matter, suffering, and redemption, themes he would later develop in works like The Divine Milieu. He argued that the incarnation, Christ taking on matter as flesh, was not an isolated event in the ancient past, but a revelation of how God continually invests in the material processes of the universe. Therefore, the horrors of war did not negate God's plan. Rather, they underscored the dramatic tension at the heart of an evolving cosmos that had not yet reached its fulfillment. Teilhard saw every act of courage, empathy, or prayer on the battlefield as part of the slow, painful forging of a more unified humanity. After the war, Teilhard briefly returned to Jesuit communities in France. The old caution regarding his evolutionary ideas remained, though the war had softened some ecclesiastical hearts to new perspectives. Teilhard was granted a measure of academic freedom to pursue advanced studies, with the hope that he might one day serve as a professor in Catholic institutions. Yet his superiors also recognized that his talents lay in the field, and so they began to encourage him to participate in paleontological expeditions. He thus embarked on a new chapter, leaving behind the static horrors of trench warfare for the dynamic quest of unearthing Earth's ancient past. He resumed geological and paleontological studies at the Sorbonne under the mentorship of noted scholars who were intrigued by his combination of devout faith and scientific rigor. They found in him an unusual openness to interdisciplinary thought. Teilhard, for his part, cultivated friendships with other Catholic scientists who likewise sought to bridge the perceived gap between Darwinian evolution and Christian doctrine. In those intellectual circles, he was able to speak more openly of his belief that evolution was not merely a biological phenomenon, but a cosmic one, involving the entire sweep of matter and spirit. The war had taught him that the stakes of this conversation were immense. If humanity persisted in thinking of religion and science as mutually exclusive, the result could be moral and existential confusion, potentially fueling further conflicts. But if religion and science could be harmonized, they might together provide humanity with a sense of purpose and direction. Between 1919 and 1922, Teilhard spent time traveling to various fossil sites in Europe. He helped classify prehistoric remains, studying strata that offered new insights into the transitions between species. During these excavations, he often wrote letters detailing his sense of cosmic wonder. He described to one friend how each fossil skull reminded him that consciousness did not arise fully formed, but was the outcome of countless trials and adaptations over millennia. He saw in these fragments of ancient beings the glimmer of future humanity, a slow ascent toward self-awareness. He believed that just as life had moved from the simple to the complex, so too would human consciousness evolve toward a collective unity, informed by love, knowledge, and divine grace. This was not a simplistic, linear progression in his mind. He recognized that evolution was marked by setbacks and blind alleys. But at its deepest core, he saw a directionality that pointed beyond itself. By 1922, Teilhard's growing reputation as a paleontologist and his passionate advocacy for an evolutionary Christianity drew both admirers and skeptics. He was invited to present papers at scientific conferences, where he impressed listeners with his knowledge of stratigraphy and the fossil record. He was also beginning to draw the attention of more conservative members of the Jesuit order, some of whom worried that his ideas might stray too close to modernism, a movement that had been condemned by Pope Pius VI in 1907. Teilhard took care to frame his thoughts in a manner consistent with Catholic doctrine, but he could not hide his excitement about evolution's potential to reshape theological thinking. He argued that the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of evolution, far from being contradictory, complemented each other. Creation was ongoing, an act that spanned eons. To him, the Genesis narratives were not scientific accounts, but profound theological statements about divine purpose, human dignity, and the nature of sin. The real challenge lay in updating theological language to incorporate the insights of modern science, not in rejecting evolution for fear of undermining faith. His colleagues found him a complex figure, deeply mystical yet thoroughly grounded in empirical research. Unlike some scientists of the time who were turning away from religion, Teilhard saw faith as a vital component of the quest for truth. And unlike some religious thinkers who feared scientific developments, Teilhard believed that faith was strengthened by a clear-eyed engagement with science. He was, in a sense, his own discipline, a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist who believed in a Christ who beckoned the entire universe onward. The tension in his vocation was palpable and occasionally painful. At times he felt misunderstood by fellow Jesuits who deemed his ideas too speculative, and he felt equally out of step among secular scientists who could not fathom his insistence on a divine telos. Yet he persevered, fueled by a sense of mission. One of his mentors, the Jesuit scientist Pierre Roussel, recognized Teilhard's potential impact. Roussel wrote in a letter to a colleague that Teilhard possessed a searing insight into the spiritual dimension of matter, a perspective that might one day galvanize a new generation of Catholic thinkers. Roussel and others believed that Teilhard's experiences in the war had matured him, forging in him a firm resolve not to shy away from controversy. It was clear that Teilhard had a message to share, a message of cosmic hope that might resonate with those disillusioned by the war. Teilhard's growing mastery of paleontology was soon tested on a grand scale. In the early 1920s, there was a surge of interest in studying early human fossils in Asia, particularly in China. The Jesuits, with their historical legacy of missionary presence in the East, were keen to have scientifically trained priests who could also serve as ambassadors of goodwill and cultural exchange. Teilhard found himself invited to join an international research team investigating fossil sites near Beijing, specifically in the region known for the discovery of Peking man, an early hominin classified as Homo erectus. This was precisely the kind of opportunity Teilhard had dreamed of, to stand on the cutting edge of paleontological discovery while representing the Church's openness to science. In 1923, Teilhard set sail for China, beginning what would become a decades-long association with the land and its rich fossil record. From the moment he arrived, he was struck by the grandeur and complexity of Chinese civilization, with its long history, spiritual traditions, and vast landscapes. This ancient culture, he believed, provided yet another vantage point to observe humanity's evolutionary trajectory. Here, the modern pursuit of fossils intersected with millennia of philosophical and religious reflection. Teilhard was fascinated not only by the geology, but also by the interplay of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist ideas that shaped Chinese society. His Jesuit predecessors in the 17th century had once sought to bridge European Christianity and Chinese wisdom. Teilhard hoped, in his own way, to continue that dialogue, but now in a scientific era. At the fossil sites, Teilhard found abundant evidence of early human presence. Alongside other researchers, he helped unearth skull fragments, teeth, and stone tools that shed light on the daily life of these prehistoric hominins. For Teilhard, each fossil was far more than an object of academic interest. It was a clue in the grand puzzle of how consciousness had emerged on Earth. Often, after a long day of excavation, he would reflect in his journal on how these ancient remains testified to the slow awakening of intellect and self-awareness. He noted the thick skull structures of Homo erectus, the rudimentary stone implements, the traces of fire usage. To him, these were milestones in a cosmic pilgrimage from mere matter to mind. At night, he would sometimes celebrate Mass in a small, improvised chapel, uniting his findings of the day with the sacramental reality he cherished. The two worlds, science and religion, were not separate compartments in his mind, but two beams of light illuminating the same tapestry. His time in China also brought him into contact with other Western scientists, geologists, anthropologists, and archaeologists who had come to explore Asia's paleontological riches. Many of these colleagues were secular in orientation. Teilhard surprised them with his breadth of knowledge, his meticulous field techniques, and his unwavering curiosity about the spiritual implications of their discoveries. He became a trusted collaborator on important digs, eventually earning international recognition for his contributions. During evenings at research stations, he would enter lively discussions on the philosophical meaning of evolution, offering insights that blended empirical data with theological speculation. Some scientists found his viewpoint intriguing, even if they remained skeptical of his religious convictions. Others dismissed his attempts at synthesis as too metaphysical for the laboratory. Yet Teilhard quietly persisted, convinced that the future of humanity required precisely such an integrative vision. In 1926, Teilhard returned briefly to France to renew contact with Jesuit authorities and present preliminary findings. During this furlough, he also encountered a series of official inquiries regarding the theological dimensions of his work. Certain members of the Jesuit hierarchy had read his essays, which circulated privately among friends, and expressed concern that he was straying from orthodox interpretations of the doctrine of original sin. Teilhard was summoned to explain how, in an evolutionary framework, one might account for the entry of sin into human history. Teilhard responded by emphasizing that the reality of sin and the need for redemption remained fundamental, but he interpreted the Adam and Eve story in a less literal, more symbolic sense. He proposed that sin emerged at the threshold where human consciousness became aware of moral responsibility, leading to deliberate choices that deviated from divine love. In Teilhard's view, this was fully compatible with evolutionary theory. Still, the explanation did not satisfy everyone. Some in the church worried that once the literal first parents were removed from the discussion, the entire edifice of salvation history might be weakened. Teilhard, for his part, strove to articulate that the mystery of salvation did not depend on a literalistic reading of Genesis, but rather on the fundamental truths it conveyed. That God created the world with purpose, that humanity freely chose to deviate from that purpose, and that Christ's incarnation and redemptive work restored the path to unity. Realizing that his ideas might be causing unrest, Teilhard chose to emphasize his obedience as a Jesuit. Though disappointed by the cautious stance of his superiors, he was determined not to break with the church he loved. He also saw with some clarity that the theological climate of the time was not entirely ready for the bold cosmic theology he envisioned. So he returned to China in 1926, continuing his fieldwork and quietly refining his synthesis, trusting that the time would come when his ideas would find broader acceptance. Back in China, Teilhard's involvement in significant paleontological discoveries continued to grow. He was part of the team that uncovered more remains of Peking man, contributing to a deeper understanding of Homo erectus and its place in the human lineage. He wrote scientific articles that were well received, enhancing his reputation among experts. Meanwhile, he continued to draft more speculative essays, many of which would form the backbone of The Phenomenon of Man. In these writings, he proposed that evolution is best understood not merely as a random process, but as something that displays a pattern of increasing complexity and centralization, ultimately giving rise to reflective consciousness. He emphasized that once consciousness emerged, evolution entered a new phase. This phase, the noosphere, a term he borrowed from his friend, the philosopher Edouard Leroy, marked the collective thought layer of the Earth, a domain in which ideas, culture, and spirituality evolve and interconnect, further propelling humanity toward unity. These ideas were radical for their time. Most scientists were still preoccupied with the mechanisms of natural selection, genetics, and fossil taxonomy. Teilhard's broader teleological perspective was seen as speculative or even poetic, lacking the empirical strictness expected of scientific theory. On the ecclesiastical side, many theologians saw Teilhard's emphasis on cosmic progression toward an omega point as risking pantheistic or heretical overtones. Teilhard's greatness, perhaps, lay in his willingness to navigate both these critiques, refusing to abandon his conviction that the universe must be understood in its totality, as a continuous, God-ordained movement from primordial matter toward divine fulfillment. China, too, was going through major upheavals during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Political instability, the rise of competing factions, and the looming threat of Japanese invasion made fieldwork increasingly difficult. Teilhard persevered, spending weeks or months in remote dig sites, collecting data and musing on the destiny of humankind. He occasionally traveled to Beijing, where he joined intellectual salons that brought together Chinese and Western scholars. There, he encountered not only scientists, but also philosophers who introduced him more deeply to concepts from Buddhism and Taoism. Teilhard found resonances between these Eastern traditions and his own cosmic vision. The notion of interconnectedness, so central to Eastern philosophy, dovetailed with his understanding of an evolving cosmos in which no part existed in isolation. He believed that Christian theology, properly expanded, could include these insights, giving a comprehensive account of reality that embraced both Eastern and Western viewpoints. During these years, he penned essays that would later be compiled into works like The Heart of Matter, The Divine Milieu, and The Phenomenon of Man. However, official church approval for publishing such works was not forthcoming. Teilhard sent drafts to his friends in Europe, including prominent theologians, hoping to generate a quiet dialogue that might pave the way for eventual acceptance. The feedback he received was mixed. Some praised his daring scope, noting how his vision might reinvigorate Christianity in an era when many intellectuals were deserting the church for secular ideologies. Others cautioned him that he risked censure, pointing to the Vatican's recent history of clamping down on innovative thinkers. Despite these cautions, Teilhard's personal faith remained unwavering. He continued celebrating Mass each day, usually in small chapels at field stations, sometimes alone. Over time, he developed the habit of offering Mass with a special intention: the spiritual and physical evolution of humanity. In these private devotions, he consecrated not only the bread and wine, but symbolically the entire earth, all the joys and sufferings, the discoveries and conflicts, the living and the dead, merging them in a cosmic liturgy. This mystical practice was profoundly personal to him, yet it was also aligned with his desire to integrate the full sweep of creation into the sphere of divine grace. The 1930s brought new challenges. Economic depression in the West impacted research funding, and the political climate in China grew tense. Teilhard, now in his 50s, found his energies taxed by the rigors of fieldwork and the uncertainties of the time. Yet he pressed on, traveling to other regions, including Inner Mongolia, where more fossil discoveries awaited. This was a time of seemingly endless journeys by caravan or train across deserts and rugged terrain. At night, Teilhard would lie under vast, star-filled skies, reflecting on the billions of years that preceded Homo sapiens. He saw the same story unfolding across countless galaxies: the slow shaping of matter, the potential rise of life, and the eventual awakening of reflective consciousness. In his notes, he speculated that the incarnation could be an event of universal significance, perhaps echoing beyond Earth. These were heady ideas, as far ahead of their time as they were out of step with many church authorities. But for Teilhard, they were the logical extension of taking seriously both the Christian claim of Christ's cosmic role and the scientific claim of an immense, evolving universe. Amid these intellectual pursuits, Teilhard maintained contact with the Jesuit hierarchy. He made occasional returns to Europe, each time hoping that his superiors might relent in their hesitation to grant him official imprimaturs for publication. Each time, however, the response was guarded. Church officials recognized his brilliance, but worried that his proposals about original sin, the resurrection, and the cosmic Christ might confuse the faithful. Teilhard was instructed to revise and clarify. He did so patiently, though each revision felt like a compromise of his visionary scope. Yet he never seriously contemplated leaving the Jesuits or breaking away from Rome. His sense of obedience was both a matter of principle and an expression of love for the tradition that had nurtured him. He believed that genuine development of doctrine often meets resistance at first, and that eventually the Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, would catch up to new realities. In private letters, he acknowledged his frustration but insisted on remaining within the fold, trusting that time would vindicate his perspective. This period also saw Teilhard begin to wrestle with the notion that human evolution had taken a distinctly social and cultural turn. Technology, communication, and global travel were knitting humanity into an interdependent web. While the war years had shown him the destructive potential of technology, the post-war years demonstrated how rapidly society could change through scientific progress. Teilhard believed that the next step in evolution would be a growth in global consciousness, a recognition that all peoples share a common destiny. In the 1930s, with the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe and escalating tensions in Asia, he recognized that this new consciousness was far from guaranteed. He wrote anxiously about the possibility of another catastrophic war. Still, he remained hopeful that adversity might again push humanity toward a sense of solidarity. Shortly before the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, Teilhard was forced to take refuge in Beijing as field expeditions became unsafe. There, he used the quieter times to collate his notes, refine his manuscripts, and engage with a small but devoted circle of colleagues and friends. Those who interacted with him during this phase were struck by his unwavering warmth, humility, and boundless curiosity. Many recounted how, after hours of intense conversation on geology or theology, he would pivot to discussing an insect he found or a sunset's hues. That childlike wonder with which he'd once roamed the hills of Auvergne had never left him. Even as his hair greyed and his shoulders bore the weight of potential condemnation from the Church, Teilhard seemed lit from within by the conviction that all of creation was suffused with divine radiance. During this restless interwar period, he also made brief trips outside China, including to the United States, where he visited museums and universities interested in Asian paleontological findings. In these visits, he sowed seeds for future dialogue, speaking to American scientists and theologians who found in him a rare combination of academic rigor and spiritual depth. A few younger scholars, Catholic and otherwise, were captivated by his ideas, sensing that he was outlining a path beyond the stale impasse of religion versus science. Teilhard's unassuming manner and obvious expertise lent credibility to his bold claims about a universe converging toward a transcendent center. He was invited to lecture at several institutions, though always in an unofficial capacity, as the Church's restrictions prevented him from speaking with full ecclesiastical endorsement. Yet word began to spread. There was a Jesuit in China who saw evolution not as a threat to religion, but as the key to understanding the fullness of Christ's redemptive work. The increasingly troubled global situation in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japan's invasion of China, the rise of Nazism in Europe, and the onset of World War II complicated Teilhard's life once again. He found himself briefly interned in Beijing when foreign nationals were restricted, though he was treated relatively well, given the respect generally accorded to clergy and academics. During these trying times, he clung more than ever to his vision of a cosmic Christ who united suffering humanity in a single evolutionary leap. From China, he watched in horror as Europe descended into another devastating war, recalling his own trauma in the trenches during World War I. Yet even this second conflagration did not extinguish his hope. In letters to friends in Europe, he argued that the repeated tragedy of war indicated that humanity was still in the throes of a difficult but real transformation. If we could only see our unity at a deeper level, he wrote, these nationalistic and ideological struggles might give way to a shared sense of purpose. As the 1940s progressed, Teilhard's health began to decline. The harsh conditions of field expeditions, combined with the stress of political instability, weighed on him. Yet he continued his work with determined energy, organizing notes and manuscripts, drafting what he hoped would be his magnum opus, a grand statement of how evolution, biology, theology, and mysticism all fit together in a comprehensive worldview. He gave it a tentative title, The Phenomenon of Man. He believed it would demonstrate unequivocally that humanity's story could not be told without God, and that Christianity's story could not be told without evolution. By the end of episode 2 in his life's trajectory, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin stood as a figure shaped by two worldwide conflicts, tested by the rigors of the battlefield and the field site, balanced between loyalty to a cautious church and the pursuit of a daring new synthesis. The seeds of the phenomenon of man were sown in these tumultuous years, nurtured by his experiences of war, his dialogues with Eastern philosophies, and the tangible fossil evidence he had collected with his own hands. The idea of a universe in process, of matter emerging into spirit, converging toward a divine center, was no longer a mere speculation for him, but a truth for which he was willing to sacrifice his reputation, his comfort, and, if needed, his very standing within the religious community he served. In the next phase of his life, Teilhard would muster his remaining strength to refine and present this grand synthesis, even as the world he inhabited continued to convulse with conflict. He had seen firsthand the cost of ignoring our shared human bonds. He believed the time had come for a bold proclamation that humanity's evolutionary destiny was to become one in Christ, not through uniformity imposed by force, but through the voluntary convergence of free, reflective, and loving persons. His wartime experiences had convinced him that God's presence, though hidden, was palpable in the depths of suffering and in the stirring of hope. That same hidden presence, he believed, sustained the upward thrust of evolution from the primeval past, guiding the cosmos toward an omega point of divinization. It was a message waiting to be fully articulated, a message that, in the years to come, would captivate readers worldwide and spark debate both within and beyond the Church. Episode 3. The Emergence of the Phenomenon of Man. When the Second Global Conflict subsided in 1945, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin found himself in a world drastically changed, politically, socially, and scientifically. His many years in China had ended only with difficulty and uncertainty due to the Japanese occupation and the broader calamities of World War II. Now, in his mid-60s, he returned to a war-ravaged Europe, carrying not only the memories of conflict and displacement, but also a trove of manuscripts, notes, and nascent book drafts that he had refined during periods of relative seclusion in Beijing and elsewhere. Among these writings, one stood out as the culmination of decades of thought, fieldwork, and theological speculation, The Phenomenon of Man. This manuscript, though not yet in final form, was already recognized among Teilhard's close friends as the fullest articulation of his grand vision, a sweeping synthesis of evolution, geology, paleontology, theology, and mysticism. For years he had worked on it quietly, aware that Rome had never granted him formal permission to publish works that so extensively recast Christian doctrine. Yet he believed that the gravity of the world situation, especially after witnessing two cataclysmic wars, demanded a bold statement. He was convinced that humanity's greatest hope lay in understanding itself as part of a cosmic drama, a dynamic unfolding that led toward an ultimate point of convergence he called Omega. To keep silent, he felt, would be to withhold a vision he believed could inspire a battered generation searching for meaning amid rubble and ashes. Once settled briefly in France, Teilhard sought the counsel of fellow Jesuits and trusted theologians on how best to present his ideas. He found, however, that the ecclesiastical landscape remained cautious. The church hierarchy, vigilant as ever about deviations from orthodox teaching, had not substantially loosened its stance on evolution or on Teilhard's more speculative themes. Various officials pointed to unresolved questions. How, in Teilhard's thought, could one uphold the uniqueness of Christ if the entire cosmos was evolving toward a Christ Omega? Did Teilhard's concept of original sin align with the traditional doctrine requiring a single Adamic origin of humanity's fallen state? How could creative union be squared with the dogmatic definitions of grace and salvation? These questions, Teilhard insisted, did not strike at the heart of his commitment to church doctrine. Rather, they underscored the need for updated theological language. Teilhard's initial attempts to seek approval for publication encountered the same hesitations he had faced before. Rather than risk an outright condemnation, the Jesuit authorities advised caution, suggesting that the phenomenon of man remain an internal document for review. Teilhard acquiesced, reluctantly but obediently. He believed that in due time the Church would recognize the coherence and orthodoxy of his cosmic vision. So for the moment, he kept the manuscript in a state of limbo, revising certain passages to clarify his stance on key points of doctrine while continuing to circulate excerpts among a small circle of sympathetic readers. Privately, these readers marveled at the manuscript's scope, from the formation of the earth to the emergence of life to the gradual intensification of consciousness, culminating in the appearance of humankind and pointing beyond to a unified future. It was a narrative that wove scientific data into a mystical tapestry, recentering Christian theology on the idea that Christ operated not merely within history, but within the entire evolutionary process. Even as he juggled these negotiations with ecclesiastical authorities, Teilhard resumed his scientific endeavors. He embarked on new collaborations with European and American researchers who were piecing together humanity's deep past. With the war over, resources began flowing again into paleontological and archaeological projects. Scientists around the world were keen to understand the legacy of human evolution, from the earliest Homo erectus sites in Asia to the Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon remains in Europe, to newly discovered clues in Africa that pushed the timeline of hominin origins even further back. Teilhard's reputation in paleontology was well established by now. He was respected for his meticulous field methods, his careful stratigraphic analyses, and his uncanny ability to place a single fossil fragment within the grand context of life's progression. Although some of his colleagues had little interest in the spiritual or theological dimensions he brought to the table, they valued his expertise and welcomed his contributions to major research papers. If the Church was still undecided about Teilhard, the scientific community increasingly considered him a veteran figure who had advanced the understanding of early human evolution, particularly through his work on Peking man. At the same time, Teilhard's worldview continued to evolve. One might assume that his thinking would have stabilized by this point. After all, he was in his mid-60s, physically worn and fighting bouts of poor health. Yet his diaries reveal that he was continually revisiting his core concepts. He refined the notion of the noosphere, the sphere of collective human thought, which he saw as a natural outgrowth of the geosphere, the solid earth, and the biosphere, the realm of life. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, with the advent of global communications, radio broadcasts, and the beginnings of what would become television, Teilhard sensed that the noosphere was being woven together at an accelerating pace. He saw parallels to how life itself had intensified over geological time, initially slow but eventually blossoming into remarkable diversity and complexity. So too, he believed, would the web of consciousness enveloping the planet grow denser and more interconnected, fostering empathy, knowledge, and unity across national boundaries. Yet Teilhard was never naive about the obstacles. War and violence continued in various parts of the globe, and the nuclear age had ushered in the terrifying possibility of complete annihilation. Scientific progress, for all its benefits, carried risks that made the mechanized killing of World War I and II look modest in comparison. Teilhard recognized that evolution did not guarantee moral progress. Rather, it offered a framework for understanding the push toward unification in tension with forces of disintegration. Free will, in his view, played a crucial role. Humankind could choose to collaborate with the forward thrust of evolution, uniting, transcending egoistic impulses and aligning with Christ Omega, or it could succumb to division and self-destruction. In the phenomenon of man, he would make the case that the interior dynamic of matter and spirit made unity the ultimate outcome. but he left room for the risk of partial failure. If humans refused to heed the call of convergence, the evolutionary process might shatter or stall, at least in our earthly domain. During these post-war years, Teilhard also traveled to the United States several times, initially for lectures at scientific gatherings and eventually to spend longer periods at institutions interested in his work, such as the Venner Foundation for Anthropological Research. In America, he found a somewhat more open environment, at least with respect to discussing evolution, than he had often encountered in Europe. Although he still had to navigate church oversight, he was able to present aspects of his vision to mixed audiences of believers and non-believers alike. Attendees at these talks often remarked on his quiet charisma, a gentle, unassuming Jesuit priest who spoke of the cosmos in expansive, almost poetic terms, yet who possessed impeccable scientific credentials. Some found it baffling. How could someone integrate such a lofty, mystical interpretation of evolution with the nitty-gritty of stratigraphic data and fossil classification? But many were intrigued. A small but growing number of intellectuals began to see in Teilhard a thinker who might reconcile what had seemed hopelessly divided in Western culture: the scientific narrative of cosmic and biological evolution and the religious narrative of divine purpose and redemption. Teilhard's openness to a global perspective also resonated with certain forward-looking circles in the United States, where the concept of a one-world future had gained traction after the war. Teilhard's notion of a convergent humanity, culminating in a shared consciousness of love, science, and divine presence, aligned with certain aspirations for international cooperation. He often discussed the importance of global governance, the need for international institutions that could mediate conflicts, distribute resources, and foster solidarity. For Teilhard, these were not merely political imperatives, they were evolutionary imperatives. From his vantage point, the future demanded that humanity bind itself together in new forms of community. Otherwise, the race for nuclear and technological dominance would lead to mutual destruction. He saw Christ's call to love one's neighbor as the ultimate impetus behind this global unity, but he also believed that natural evolution on the social plane was pushing us in that same direction. Partly because of his frequent travels and partly because of his rising profile as both a scientist and a thinker, Teilhard began to draw the attention of influential lay Catholics who were themselves seeking to modernize the Church's stance on scientific and social issues. Some saw in Teilhard a potential ally to help shift Catholic theology away from a defensive posture. He received invitations to write prefaces or commentaries for works on science and religion, though he had to tread carefully. Any official publication needed approval from his Jesuit superiors. He typically responded by offering insights that stayed close to safe doctrinal ground, but with enough of his signature visionary quality to spark curiosity. It was, at times, a frustrating dance. He longed to share the full sweep of the phenomenon of man, yet remained bound by obedience to refrain from a public release without official permission. In these years, Teilhard also observed with keen interest the emergent field of genetics. The discovery of genes and the early explorations into DNA's structure, which would culminate in the double helix breakthrough in 1953, underscored his belief that evolution was driven by deep informational processes at the heart of life itself. While he lacked the laboratory training of a molecular biologist, he grasped the significance. Genetics was providing a mechanism for evolutionary change that fits seamlessly into his vision of an ascending complexity. The more science uncovered the intricacies of life, he felt, the more it exposed the hidden architecture by which matter transcended itself in consciousness. Indeed, though Teilhard did not write extensively on genetics in The Phenomenon of Man, he saw it as supporting evidence that matter had an innate capacity to organize and integrate towards something higher. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw Teilhard's health begin a noticeable decline. A lifetime of travel, fieldwork, war service, and the privations he experienced in China had taken their toll. He suffered from recurring respiratory issues, bouts of exhaustion, and at times heart trouble. Yet even as his body weakened, his intellectual output seemed to intensify. He worked with quiet desperation, fearing that time was running short. He refined chapters of the phenomenon of man, wrote additional essays on spirituality and evolution, and composed letters that tried to distill his central message, that the universe was a single, immense evolutionary event, pregnant with meaning, culminating in a Christ who was both personal savior and universal center. In these letters, his tone alternated between hopefulness and resignation. He still believed the Church might one day lift its hesitations, but he also recognized that he might not live to see that day. A flicker of hope emerged when he learned that certain friends in Europe and America had read sections of the phenomenon of man and found them profoundly moving. A small circle of intellectuals began to champion Teilhard's cause, urging the Jesuit order to consider the potential fruits of publication. They argued that, far from undermining faith, Teilhard's work offered a robust apologetic for Christianity in a century dominated by secular ideologies. They pointed out that totalitarian regimes on both the right and the left had exploited scientific narratives stripped of ethical and spiritual depth, leading to horrors on a scale never before seen. Teilhard's approach, they claimed, might inspire a more humane application of science, rooted in a cosmic understanding of divine love. But for the most part, these pleas fell on wary ears within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Many older theologians still remembered the modernist crisis, in which various Catholic scholars at the turn of the century had been disciplined or excommunicated for challenging biblical literalism and traditional doctrines. They feared that Teilhard could spark a similar crisis, and with the Holy Office, the modern Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, still vigilant about perceived errors, few were willing to take the risk of endorsing Teilhard's ideas openly. Undeterred, Teilhard continued his routine of partial compliance. He did not publish the phenomenon of man without permission, but he shared it quietly, even passionately, with those he trusted. He also wrote new essays that circled the same central themes, emphasizing that spirit and matter were not irreconcilable opposites, but rather two dimensions of the same evolutionary reality. He underscored that the incarnation bound God to the material world at its core. God did not merely act upon matter from outside, but entered it fully in Christ. And he reiterated that humanity's future hinged on a collective transformation of consciousness, what he sometimes called planetization, a spiritual and social unity that would not obliterate individual personalities, but rather fulfill them in a higher synthesis. This was a mystical concept, but it was also an evolutionary concept, echoing the idea of creative union found elsewhere in his writings. During one of his longer visits to the United States in the early 1950s, Teilhard was invited to spend time at the Frick Laboratory in New York, associated with the American Museum of Natural History. He found an environment somewhat more relaxed than in France, with respect to church constraints. There, among fellow scientists, he could discuss his ideas on the interplay of evolution and faith without the same immediate fear of ecclesiastical repercussions. He also formed new friendships with American Jesuits who admired his work, even if they, too, had to remain cautious. This semi-exile in the United States would turn out to be his final chapter on Earth. Feeling increasingly unwell, Teilhard decided to stay in New York, lodging with friends, continuing to write and to engage in conversations with curious laypeople and academics. Though he missed France, and especially the Auvergne region of his youth, he sensed that Providence had guided him here. America had always seemed to him a land of great dynamism and openness, qualities he believed were essential for the next stage of human evolution. On Easter Sunday, April 10th, 1955, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin died of a heart attack in New York City. He was 73. That he passed away on Easter, Christianity's feast of resurrection, struck many of his friends as poignantly symbolic. Here was the man who had devoted his life to proclaiming that matter itself was destined for resurrection, that evolution was the slow unveiling of a cosmic Christ who would eventually draw all creation into a sublime union. Now, at the end, Teilhard entered the mystery of death on the very day the liturgy proclaimed new life. Yet his final hours also carried a sense of unfulfillment. He had never received official permission to publish his masterpiece, The Phenomenon of Man. He had never seen the day when church authorities would embrace his theological perspective wholeheartedly. But his story did not end with his death. Within just a few years, friends and admirers organized to bring his unpublished works to the public. In 1955, thanks to their efforts and aided by the fact that Teilhard was now beyond any threat of condemnation, The Phenomenon of Man finally saw the light of day. At first, it was released in French, followed by translations into English and other languages. Its impact was immediate and substantial, generating a wave of enthusiasm among readers who were hungry for a worldview that reconciled the age of science with a deep spirituality. Reviewers marveled at Teilhard's breadth. He seemed equally at home discussing the second law of thermodynamics, the evolutionary significance of hominin fossils, and the biblical theology of St. Paul. He drew analogies between the processes of cosmogenesis, the birth and development of the universe, biogenesis, the emergence of life, and noogenesis, the awakening of mind, culminating in Christogenesis, the birth of Christ in the hearts of all. It was heady, exhilarating, and unlike any religious text most people had encountered. Of course, the publication also drew critics. Secular scientists pointed out that Teilhard's teleological approach was not strictly scientific in the sense of testable hypotheses. They questioned whether the cosmic trajectory he described had any basis in fact, or whether it was simply a hopeful extrapolation from scattered data. Some theologians, meanwhile, saw the phenomenon of man as too enamored with evolutionary language, fearing it might overshadow essential dogmas about the human soul, the need for personal salvation, and the historical uniqueness of the Incarnation. Yet, these criticisms did not stifle the broader fascination. Teilhard's posthumous fame grew, often supported by lay Catholics, liberal Protestants, and even individuals outside traditional Christian circles, who found in his work a fresh spirituality for the modern age. The sense that the cosmos was not a cold, indifferent void, but a living process shaped by divine love resonated powerfully in a mid-20th century world grappling with the aftermath of genocide, nuclear arms, and ideological strife. Within Catholicism, Teilhard found unexpected allies in the decades following his death. The Second Vatican Council, 1962–65, ushered in a spirit of aggiornamento, a refreshing openness to the modern world. Some bishops and theologians at the council had read Teilhard's works or at least heard of his evolutionary theology, and they saw parallels between his emphasis on world engagement and the council's own moves toward interfaith dialogue, social justice, and liturgical reform. Though Teilhard's name was never officially endorsed at Vatican II, many participants privately acknowledged that his integration of science and faith foreshadowed some of the Council's progressive stances. Cardinal Henri de Lubac, for instance, who had studied Teilhard's writings, later helped to disseminate portions of his thought within the new theological climate of the 1960s. Thus, by the early 1960s, the phenomenon of man had gone through multiple editions, translated into several languages, and had captured the imagination of scientists, theologians, philosophers, and a general readership intrigued by the possibility of a spiritual interpretation of evolution. Teilhard became something of a posthumous celebrity, a man whose ideas seemed ideally tailored for an era when space exploration, nuclear energy, and a rapidly expanding sense of planetary interconnectedness were reshaping human consciousness. People read his works to glean insight into how the cosmic story might offer hope for the Earth's future. They quoted his aphorisms about love being the most universal, the most formidable, and the most mysterious force. They invoked his image of a converging humanity in global movements for peace and reconciliation. Even those who found themselves at odds with certain theological or scientific specifics recognized that Teilhard had tapped into a primal human yearning, the desire to believe that the universe has a purpose, that our labors and sufferings are not in vain, and that there is a transcendent horizon beckoning us toward fullness. This surge in popularity was not without ironies. Teilhard, who had spent so much of his life defending his ideas against suspicion within the Church, was now hailed by many Catholics as a prophetic figure. Universities named lecture halls and symposium series after him. Scholars began publishing commentaries, dissertations, and conferences dedicated to analyzing his synthesis. In some ways, Teilhard's moment had finally arrived, just when he could no longer personally participate in the conversation. Perhaps this fact lends a certain poignancy to his legacy. It calls to mind those mystics and visionaries of past centuries whose work was misunderstood or censored during their lifetimes, only to be celebrated later as the theological climate shifted. For Teilhard's closest friends and colleagues, watching this posthumous reception was a bittersweet experience. They remembered how gently he had tried to present his vision, always with deference to church authority, always with the hope that official approbation might be granted. They also recalled his extraordinary personal warmth, the ease with which he moved between prayer and scientific discussion, and the patience with which he endured years of silence about his unpublished manuscripts. Now, seeing the phenomenon of man on bookshelves worldwide, they felt both relief and a keen sense of, if only he had lived to see this. Yet they also recognized that the conversation on evolution and faith was continuing to develop in ways that Teilhard could never have fully anticipated. Fields like molecular biology, astrophysics, and computer science were poised to offer new insights into the nature of life, consciousness, and the cosmos. By the time the phenomenon of man had made its mark on mid-20th century thought, Teilhard's other writings, such as The Divine Milieu and The Future of Man, also began circulating widely. These texts amplified his central ideas, focusing particularly on how ordinary human endeavors, work, relationships, art, technology, could become part of a transformative spiritual path if understood through the lens of cosmic evolution. Teilhard contended that each human life was a microcosm of the universe's overall movement, that our personal growth mirrored the unfolding complexity of the cosmos. By uniting ourselves to Christ, he argued, we did not escape from matter, but rather divinized it from within, contributing to that final convergence at Omega. This sacramental view of reality struck a chord with many Catholics who saw in Teilhard's approach a way to integrate daily life with the sacred, bridging the gulf that had too often separated Sunday liturgy from Monday's worldly engagements. Some critics wondered whether Teilhard had adequately grappled with the reality of sin, evil, and suffering. Did his emphasis on the forward thrust of evolution risk downplaying the tragic dimensions of history? In the phenomenon of man, he had recognized suffering and evil as real, but insisted they were harnessed by the deeper process of union. For him, the cross of Christ was the emblem of that harnessing. Divinity entered the darkest aspects of matter and history, absorbing them into a transcendent love. Still, some theologians felt he did not provide a rigorous account of how exactly redemption worked in a cosmic context. Teilhard's mystical statements might have been too lyrical for those seeking precise doctrinal formulations. Yet for many readers, his approach offered more than enough impetus to think anew about the Christ event in relation to billions of years of cosmic history. Another area of critique emerged from non-theistic scientists who admired Teilhard's knowledge of fossils but dismissed his teleological ideas as scientifically untestable. They pointed out that mainstream evolutionary theory did not necessarily posit a direction toward higher consciousness, but merely a process of adaptation and diversification. The big question was whether the tendency toward increased complexity was a statistical quirk or a genuine arrow built into the fabric of the cosmos. Teilhard, of course, held the latter position, believing that complexity, consciousness, and union were as fundamental as gravity or electromagnetism, though he admitted these were not strictly scientific concepts in the laboratory sense. They required a philosophical and spiritual interpretation of the empirical data. To this day, debates continue over whether Teilhard's approach can be reconciled with neo-Darwinian frameworks or whether it stands apart as an essentially theological narrative. Yet for all these discussions, the central fact remained. The phenomenon of man was, and still is, widely read and discussed. It injected new energy into conversations about evolution, not merely as a set of biological facts, but as a story that touches the deepest questions of human identity, purpose, and destiny. Teilhard's cosmic Christ and his vision of an ever-increasing union of minds were seized upon by those seeking a more hopeful narrative in the shadow of nuclear threats and Cold War anxieties. They found in his work an antidote to the bleak existentialism that had permeated much of post-war Europe, an invitation to see time and space not as a vast emptiness, but as a theatre of divine action. Even the Church, over time, began to soften its stance. While never offering an outright ecclesiastical endorsement, influential figures, such as Pope Paul VI in the 1960s, Pope John Paul II in the late 20th century, and Pope Benedict XVI in the early 21st, spoke of evolution in ways that opened the door to Teilhardian interpretations. Pope John Paul II's 1996 address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences notably acknowledged that evolution was more than a hypothesis, a shift that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Although official Vatican documents did not cite Teilhard explicitly, the mere fact that the Church's teaching could accommodate an evolutionary framework suggested that Teilhard's pioneering efforts were not in vain. A new generation of Catholic theologians and scientists took inspiration from his works, weaving his insights into the ongoing dialogue between faith and reason. Some credited him with laying the groundwork for what later became known as theistic evolution, or evolutionary theology, even as they continued to debate the specifics of his doctrine. Thus, by the end of episode 3 in Teilhard's biography, we see him standing at the threshold of what would become an extraordinary posthumous adventure for his ideas. Though he had died without seeing his magnum opus published, the phenomenon of man quickly found an audience across multiple continents and disciplines, igniting discussions that persist to this day. In that sense, Teilhard's life story illustrated the paradox of timing. A prophet to some, a suspect innovator to others, Teilhard had pushed the boundaries of Catholic thought so far that the official apparatus could not accommodate him in life. Yet in the sudden freedom granted by death, his writings soared, carried by the same cosmic current he had so passionately described. In bridging evolution and Christianity, two forces often locked in confrontation, he bequeathed to future generations a bold invitation to see matter as permeated by spirit, to see the cross as planted in the very heart of an evolving world, and to see the destiny of humankind not as fragmentation, but as a sublime unity in Christ, the omega point. He had not achieved this synthesis easily. The forging of the phenomenon of man was a lifetime's work, shaped by the fires of war, the rigors of scientific research, the tensions within the Church, and the personal mystical insights that had guided him ever since he was a child, sifting through volcanic rocks in the Auvergne. In his final years, living as an émigré in the United States, Teilhard sensed that he had done what he could. The rest he entrusted to Providence. He died without fanfare, but the manuscript he left behind would become one of the most discussed religious and philosophical texts of the 20th century. Its clarion call, to see evolution as a sacred event, echoed far beyond the corridors of ecclesiastical power, resonating in the hearts and minds of those seeking a transcendent meaning for modern life. Episode 4. The Blossoming and Controversy of a New Vision. After the posthumous release of The Phenomenon of Man in 1955, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's name rapidly gained traction in intellectual and religious circles. The manuscript, which he had guarded for so many years under ecclesiastical restrictions, was finally out in the open, and its explosive mixture of evolutionary theory, cosmic mysticism, and Christian theology captured the imagination of a war-weary public. Many saw in Teilhard's work a grand narrative of hope, a conviction that humanity, despite its self-inflicted wounds, was part of an immense cosmic drama leading toward a spiritual consummation. Others found it perplexing, or even heretical, believing that Teilhard's marriage of science and religion risked distorting both. Early editions of The Phenomenon of Man came with an introduction by Julian Huxley, a renowned evolutionary biologist and a committed humanist. In his preface, Huxley praised Teilhard for his visionary scope, but acknowledged that, from a strictly scientific angle, some of the teleological language might be difficult to verify. Nevertheless, Huxley deemed Teilhard's book a very remarkable work by a very remarkable man, an assessment that helped attract a broader audience. Readers who would ordinarily shy away from Christian theology were intrigued that such a forward-thinking evolutionary synthesis should receive an endorsement, or at least a guarded commendation, from one of the era's most visible proponents of evolutionary biology. In this way, the phenomenon of man quickly spilled over the usual boundaries that separated theological treatises from secular scientific discourse. As word spread, Teilhard's ideas began to seep into multiple disciplines. Philosophers picked up on his notion that matter and spirit formed a continuum, an idea that challenged the old dualisms that had haunted Western thought since Descartes. Anthropologists were drawn to the sections where he interpreted early human evolution as the dawn of reflective consciousness, building upon his own field experience with fossil hominids. Even psychologists found resonance with Teilhard's emphasis on the collective layers of consciousness, a theme that dovetailed with nascent concepts of collective memory or archetypes. And for many theologians, especially those feeling stifled by the cautious atmosphere of the pre-Vatican and Second Church, Teilhard's cosmic Christology offered a daring new framework in which creation, incarnation, and redemption were integrated into a single unfolding process spanning billions of years. This interdisciplinary interest did not come without friction. Traditional theologians feared that Teilhard had gone too far, especially when he spoke of Christ as the omega point, suggesting a final convergence of all matter and spirit in the divine. They asked, did this emphasis on a future consummation overshadow the historical events of salvation recorded in Scripture? Was the cross reduced to a mere phase in cosmic evolution rather than the central event of redemption? Teilhard's supporters argued that he never trivialized the cross or the resurrection. Rather, he universalized them, seeing in Christ's paschal mystery the key that unlocked the meaning of all material progress. For Teilhard, Easter symbolized not only Jesus' victory over death, but also the promise that matter itself was destined for transformation. Church authorities responded with caution. Even though Teilhard had passed away, his works could still be subject to doctrinal scrutiny. Some Jesuit superiors, relieved that the complications surrounding his lifetime publications were now moot, allowed the phenomenon of man to circulate, but they remained wary of endorsing it. As sales soared and translations multiplied, more conservative corners of the Church eyed this newfound popularity with suspicion. They pointed to specific passages where Teilhard's language seemed to blur the line between nature and grace, or where his conception of original sin did not align neatly with the inherited guilt of a historical Adam. Yet at the same time, other Catholic figures, including cardinals, bishops, and influential theologians, privately expressed admiration. They recognized that Teilhard's attempt to grapple with evolution offered a path forward, especially as scientific evidence for deep time and biological complexity became increasingly indisputable. Moreover, some who had attended the early sessions of Vatican II sensed that Teilhard's expansive vision might harmonize with the Council's exhortations to engage the signs of the times and dialogue with modern thought. In the broader culture, Teilhard's reputation as a prophet of planetary unity steadily took hold. The 1950s and 1960s were periods of fervent international activity, a time when the United Nations was asserting a new role in peacekeeping, when global communication was accelerating, and when a wave of decolonization reshaped world politics. In popular magazines and lecture halls, Teilhard was cited as someone who had foreseen this planetization, insisting that human destiny required a shared consciousness that transcended national, ethnic, or ideological boundaries. His language of convergence resonated with movements for world government, international cooperation, and even the early environmental awakening that recognized Earth's ecosystems as profoundly interlinked. Many of these interpreters did not necessarily share Teilhard's specifically Christian convictions. Some were secular activists, others were devotees of Eastern spiritual traditions, but they found the concept of a humanity evolving toward wholeness exhilarating. Amid this blossoming interest, Teilhard's other major works began to appear. The divine milieu, which he had written in earlier decades, but had been barred from publishing, reached bookshelves in the late 1950s. In it, Teilhard offered a more personal and devotional complement to the phenomenon of man. Where the latter was grand and cosmic, the divine milieu was more reflective, focusing on how individual prayer and daily life could be integrated into a cosmic framework. Teilhard wrote about divinizing our activities by consciously uniting them with Christ, seeing each action, no matter how mundane, as part of the evolutionary process that draws us closer to Omega. Many readers found this perspective liberating. Instead of a stark dualism separating holy and profane activities, Teilhard posited that all genuine human striving could be caught up into the fullness of God's plan, provided we offered it in love and humility. His repeated references to harnessing our joys and sufferings as energy for the kingdom struck a chord with lay Catholics eager to find spiritual meaning in their work, families, and social commitments. Inevitably, Teilhard's rising profile also attracted detractors on the scientific front. Some evolutionary biologists balked at the notion of an inherent directionality. Modern evolutionary theory, shaped by the modern synthesis in genetics and population biology, understood evolution primarily as a combination of random mutations and natural selection with no overarching teleological aim. While scientists acknowledged that complexity had increased in some lineages, notably ours, they saw this as one pathway among many, not a universal law. Critics like the paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson dismissed Teilhard's extrapolations as a form of vitalist or teleological thinking. Simpson even suggested that Teilhard, for all his brilliance in paleontological fieldwork, was imposing a metaphysical narrative onto nature. Teilhard's defenders countered that the phenomenon of man did not claim to present a strict scientific hypothesis, but rather a meta-scientific, or theological interpretation that built upon empirical findings. At conferences and symposia during the 1960s, one could witness lively debates over whether Teilhard's cosmic perspective diluted the rigor of science or, conversely, infused it with a long-neglected sense of meaning. A number of Catholic scientists, inspired by Teilhard, attempted to develop intermediate positions. They proposed that while evolution does not necessarily require a preordained blueprint, there might be an emergent tendency toward complexity in certain conditions, especially in the realm of consciousness, and that such an emergent trend need not contradict natural selection. Rather, it might reflect deeper principles of self-organization in nature, which science was only beginning to explore in fields like systems theory or, later, chaos and complexity theory. Teilhard himself, had he lived to see these developments, would likely have been thrilled, for they hinted that nature's innate capacity for higher integration could be studied scientifically, even if not fully explained by the standard Darwinian mechanisms. Meanwhile, within the ecclesiastical sphere, Teilhard's posthumous reception continued to evolve in tandem with the waves of renewal and contention unleashed by Vatican II, 1962–65. The Council had energized Catholic intellectual life, opening doors to dialogue with modernity. Many of the Council's documents, such as Gaudium et Spes, which addressed the Church's relationship to the modern world, emphasized human dignity, social responsibility, and the unity of the human family. Teilhard's disciples saw echoes of his evolutionary humanism in phrases that spoke of the world's progressive shaping and the Church's duty to participate in that shaping. Indeed, a few of the Council's more forward-looking bishops privately cited Teilhard as an influence, although he was never formally mentioned in conciliar texts. By the time the Council ended, a generation of young theologians emerged who were interested in exploring Teilhard's cosmic Christology in greater depth, weaving it into discussions about liturgical renewal, interreligious dialogue, and even environmental stewardship. However, the 1960s were also marked by social upheaval and the rise of more radical theologies that challenged traditional Catholic structures. Liberation theology in Latin America, for instance, focused on the plight of the poor and structural injustice, themes that did not figure prominently in Teilhard's work. While Teilhard emphasized a forward thrust of humanity into unity, liberation theologians stressed the immediate imperative of social equality and political revolution. Some found Teilhard too optimistic about progress, insufficiently aware of systemic oppression. They questioned whether the cosmic evolution narrative might gloss over the entrenched realities of colonialism, racism, and economic exploitation. Yet others within liberation theology found a subtle resonance with Teilhard, especially in his emphasis on solidarity and the collective nature of redemption, seeing in his approach a potential global context for the local struggles of the marginalized. Outside the Catholic sphere, interest in Teilhard spread to mainline Protestant denominations, some of which were more openly receptive to evolutionary perspectives. Anglican theologians, for example, cited Teilhard's cosmic view of Christ as a way to integrate sacramental theology with environmental awareness. A few Eastern Orthodox scholars also engaged with Teilhard's works, detecting parallels with the concept of theosis, the notion that human beings, and ultimately all creation, are destined for divine union. Though the Orthodox tradition typically eschewed Western philosophical frameworks, certain Eastern writers appreciated Teilhard's vision of a transfigured cosmos, reminiscent of the patristic emphasis on Christ as the savior of the whole world, not just human souls. By the late 1960s, this steadily growing patchwork of Teilhard's admirers seemed to form an informal school of thought, sometimes labeled Teilhardian. People who identified with it typically shared a few key convictions: that the universe has a direction or arrow of increasing complexity, that human consciousness is a focal point in that process, making us responsible for the Earth's future, that Christ's incarnation and resurrection anchor this cosmic narrative in a concrete historical event, and that the destiny of matter is not extinction or meaninglessness, but a deeper union with spirit. They often quoted Teilhard's remark that everything that rises must converge, capturing his optimism that for all our divisions, humanity is on an evolutionary path toward unification and love. This emergent school found fertile ground among certain cultural movements of the 1970s that embraced holistic thinking, ecology, and interfaith exploration. The so-called New Age subculture, for instance, often borrowed Teilhard's vocabulary of cosmic evolution and planetary awakening, even if it downplayed his specifically Christocentric angle. Environmentalists drew on his insights about Earth's sacredness, citing him as a precursor to ecological spirituality. At the same time, more academically rigorous circles worried that Teilhard's name was being co-opted to support vague or pantheistic ideologies. Scholars like Henri de Lubac, who had known Teilhard personally, cautioned that one must read him carefully in the context of Catholic orthodoxy. Yet this caution did not stem the tide. The allure of Teilhard's cosmic perspective seemed to transcend denominational and ideological boundaries. The controversy surrounding his legacy never fully abated. In 1962, the Holy Office issued a monitum, a warning, urging that, in reading Teilhard's works, Catholics should be aware of potential ambiguities and should guard against interpretations that might deviate from church doctrine. This warning was not an outright condemnation, but signaled that Teilhard's thought still occupied a disputed space in the Church's intellectual life. For his devotees, the monitum was frustrating but unsurprising, an echo of the reservations that had dogged him in life. Yet they found it increasingly difficult to square that official stance with the undeniable fact that many reputable Catholic theologians, including some close to the papacy, were exploring Teilhard's theology with enthusiasm. Indeed, significant Catholic figures eventually offered more positive assessments. Pope Paul VI, while never formally endorsing Teilhard's entire system, spoke approvingly in private audiences about Teilhard's ardent love of Christ and profound sense of cosmic unity. Pope John Paul II, known for his own philosophical depth, publicly acknowledged the valid insights of evolutionary theory and once alluded to Teilhard's sense of cosmic convergence, though without naming him directly. By the early 2000s, Pope Benedict XVI, a meticulous theologian, had also made general references to the need for a comprehensive theology of creation that takes evolution into account. While none of these popes explicitly reversed the earlier monotum, their openness to dialogue between faith and science suggested that Teilhard's legacy was becoming less controversial and more integrated, at least unofficially, into contemporary Catholic discourse. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, scholars published monographs interpreting different facets of Teilhard's system. Some emphasized his mystical side, tracing how his private writings and letters revealed a profound spirituality of matter. Others analyzed his Christology, examining the tension between the historical Jesus of Nazareth and the cosmic Christ Omega. Still others delved into his scientific background, clarifying how his fieldwork in China informed his grand narrative. Gradually, entire institutes and societies dedicated to Teilhard's thought emerged, hosting conferences where theologians, scientists, and philosophers exchanged perspectives. Among these was the American Teilhard Association, founded to disseminate and explore his ideas in the United States. Similar organizations appeared in Europe and elsewhere, each contributing to a cross-pollination of insights. Even as Teilhard's star continued to rise in these intellectual circles, his writings also made their way into more popular domains. By the 1980s, references to the phenomenon of man cropped up in discussions about future technologies and space exploration. Proponents of the emerging global internet sometimes invoked Teilhard's concept of the noosphere, suggesting that digital networks might help actualize the thinking layer around the planet. In effect, Teilhard had anticipated the idea of a worldwide web of minds decades before the technology existed. Though he could not have foreseen the details of electronic communications, his general thesis, that human consciousness would form increasingly dense interconnections, resonated strongly as satellites and computers began to shrink the distances between people. Writers of speculative fiction seized on these themes, imagining futures where humanity might physically or mentally converge into higher forms of being. In the eyes of many readers, Teilhard was becoming a patron saint of futuristic optimism. Inevitably, critics questioned whether this appropriation of Teilhard was faithful to his original message. They pointed out that he saw the noosphere not merely as an electronic or informational grid, but as a spiritual realm, powered by love and moral responsibility. While he did predict an intensification of global connectivity, he also stressed that true convergence could not be realized by technology alone. It required a transformation of the human heart, a willingness to align personal desires with the collective good, and ultimately an openness to God's grace. Without that spiritual dimension, Teilhard warned, any increase in connectivity might just magnify humanity's destructive tendencies. Yet the popular imagination often seized on the futuristic aspects of his thought, glossing over the demanding ethical and spiritual practices he believed were essential for humanity's evolutionary advance. All the while, the theological controversies persisted in more academic venues. Some Catholic theologians accused Teilhard of conflating nature and grace, implying that evolution itself was salvific, potentially sidelining the uniqueness of Christ's atonement. Others claimed that Teilhard's emphasis on cosmic progress risked overshadowing the biblical message that salvation comes through faith, repentance, and personal union with God's will. Teilhard's defenders responded that he never denied the drama of sin and redemption. Rather, he placed it in a far larger cosmic context, wherein every moral choice participates in the upward or downward movement of evolution. They insisted that, for Teilhard, Christ was not simply a symbol of the future. Christ was the living heart of the world, the one who, through his life, death, and resurrection, had effectively steered evolution onto a trajectory of universal sanctification. Still, part of the difficulty lay in Teilhard's literary style, which was poetic, elusive, and sometimes deliberately open-ended. He had wanted to inspire reflection, not provide a closed system, and that very openness made his work vulnerable to diverse interpretations, some faithful to his intentions, others more freewheeling. By the late 1980s, Teilhard's place in theological discourse had shifted from contentious outsider to somewhat of a cult figure with an established, if still contested, reputation. In many seminaries and universities, he was taught as a pivotal figure in 20th century Catholic thought, one who paved the way for later dialogues between faith and science. At the same time, certain strongholds of conservative theology continued to regard him with deep suspicion, pointing to the original Monitum as evidence that his thought was still under an ecclesiastical cloud. Lay readers, meanwhile, often encountered Teilhard through anthologies or popular spiritual books that quoted his more inspiring passages about love, energy, and convergence. To some extent, these popularizations stripped away the complexities of his argument. Some would say they diluted his rigorous fusion of geology, paleontology, and theology, leaving behind only soaring phrases about unity and cosmic hope. Yet even these abbreviated versions contributed to spreading Teilhard's name far beyond academic circles. Another sign of Teilhard's broadening influence was the growing interest in ecological theology during the 1980s and 1990s. As concerns about pollution, species extinction, and climate change took center stage, theologians sought frameworks that could speak meaningfully about humanity's relationship to the natural world. Many found Teilhard's emphasis on the sacredness of matter and the unity of creation profoundly relevant. He had always argued that the material realm was not a disposable stage set for the human drama, but an integral participant in the divine plan destined for transfiguration. This insistence on matter's intrinsic value and its ultimate spiritual destiny aligned with the ecological conviction that human beings are deeply embedded in and responsible for the biosphere. Thus, Teilhard was increasingly cited in eco-theological works, sometimes alongside Eastern Christian writers who spoke of cosmic liturgy, or alongside St. Francis of Assisi's famous reverence for nature. Amid all this, the question lingered: would there come a day when the Catholic Church might formally rehabilitate Teilhard, perhaps removing the Monitum or endorsing aspects of his theology? Some of his proponents held out hope, citing the way church authorities had softened their view on other once controversial thinkers over time. Others felt that Teilhard did not need a formal endorsement. His ideas were already thriving in ecclesial and academic contexts. It was also possible that his voice was more potent as a quasi-outsider figure, a symbol of the daring, visionary thinker who, out of humble obedience, never openly defied the institution, but nevertheless pushed the boundaries of Catholic theology. By the turn of the millennium, Teilhard's name appeared in countless books and articles, from scientific treatises examining the philosophical implications of complexity theory to devotional guides citing his Eucharistic mysticism. Some commentators hailed him as the single most important Catholic theologian of the 20th century, at least in terms of shaping a constructive approach to evolution. Others warned that he was too idiosyncratic to serve as a universal model, that his scheme of cosmic progression might be irreconcilable with either mainstream science or mainstream Catholic doctrine if interpreted too literally. But these debates only underscored the vitality of his legacy. Instead of fading away, Teilhard had become a constant reference point in the enduring conversation about how we navigate the intersections of faith, science, and the fate of the Earth. Looking back at this era, roughly the mid-1950s to the late 1980s, it becomes clear that Teilhard's posthumous trajectory was both rapid and uneven. Rarely does a theologian achieve so much recognition across such diverse fields in such a short span of time after death. Even more rarely does a figure once regarded with suspicion become, within a couple of decades, a celebrated pioneer for a new generation of believers and seekers. Part of the appeal lay in the grand story he told, a universe billions of years old, evolving from simple particles to thinking creatures, culminating in a divine human convergence. In Teilhard's cosmos, no boundary separated matter from spirit. Everything, from the smallest proton to the largest galaxy, took part in a single, ongoing act of creation, a creation that Christ embraced in the Incarnation and carried forward through the resurrection. This bold cosmic Christianity, tinged with scientific realism, offered a path out of the old conflicts between Darwin and Genesis. In the final analysis, episode 4 of Teilhard's story is about the extraordinary blossoming of his vision in the public sphere and the controversy that inevitably came with it. This was the period when the phenomenon of man transformed from a near-suppressed text into a best-selling theological blockbuster, when the divine milieu revealed the devotional depth of Teilhard's worldview, and when scientists, theologians, and everyday readers alike grappled with the exhilarating possibility that the evolutionary story might be, at its core, a story of divine self-disclosure. It was also the era when critics demanded greater precision, cautioning that Teilhard's cosmic optimism should not ignore the harsh realities of social injustice, ecological crisis, and the nuanced mechanisms of evolution. The seeds of global reception had been sown, and the controversies that sprang up around them ensured that Teilhard's thought would remain dynamic, debated, and ever relevant to the issues of the modern world. Episode 5. Into the global conversation. In the decades following the initial controversies around the phenomenon of man and the divine milieu, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's thought continued to make significant inroads into a widening array of disciplines. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, his name was no longer confined to theological circles or paleontological field reports. Instead, he had become a point of reference in broader cultural conversations about the trajectory of human society, the role of technology in shaping consciousness, the ethical dimensions of scientific progress, and the emerging ecological crisis. While critics remained vocal, often questioning the scientific or doctrinal underpinnings of Teilhard's vision, a growing segment of the public seemed captivated by the idea that the universe was not a static backdrop, but an evolving, purpose-laden drama whose outcome mattered on both a cosmic and personal scale. One catalyst for Teilhard's broadening influence was the rapid pace of technological development. Throughout the 1960s, space exploration reached unprecedented heights, culminating in the Apollo moon landings in 1969. Astronauts sent back images of the Earth rising over the lunar horizon, a sight that for many dramatically changed their sense of humanity's place in the cosmos. Environmental thinker and historian Lynn White Jr. once noted that these space-age images of our small blue planet made the global perspective inescapable, a shift that Teilhard had anticipated with his concept of the noosphere. Writers and commentators, witnessing how the planet could be seen as a single, fragile sphere, drew upon Teilhard's ideas of convergence and cosmic unity to describe the significance of this new vantage point. To them, Teilhard appeared almost prophetic, having described decades earlier a planetary consciousness that would eventually arise once humanity recognized its collective destiny. Such discussions also dovetailed with emerging environmental movements in the West. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, had ignited widespread concern about the impact of pesticides on ecosystems. From that spark grew a deeper awareness of pollution, resource depletion, and loss of biodiversity. Environmental activists and theologians alike began to look for philosophical and religious frameworks that could ground a sense of human responsibility for the Earth's future. Teilhard's emphasis on the sacredness of matter and the cosmic significance of each evolutionary step made him an attractive resource. Unlike viewpoints that saw humanity as separate from or above nature, Teilhard's universe was one continuous fabric in which human consciousness served as the latest and most precariously responsible phase of development. Here was a theological perspective that could fortify ecological ethics, suggesting that care for creation was not a mere duty, but a participation in the forward thrust of cosmic evolution itself. In parallel, the late 1960s and early 1970s saw a burst of interest in holistic spirituality, often intersecting with Eastern religious traditions and countercultural movements in Europe and North America. Yoga, meditation, and alternative healing practices gained popularity. Many of those exploring such practices found Teilhard appealing because he offered a Christian-based cosmic mysticism that did not seem as rigid or authoritarian as older forms of institutional religion. Teilhard's notion that the entire cosmos was suffused with divine energy resonated with seekers who wanted an expansive, integrative view of spirituality, one that honored science and the physical world rather than rejecting them. While some of these readers might have overlooked the distinctly Christ-centered pivot of Teilhard's theology, focusing instead on his cosmic language, they nonetheless helped spread his name in popular spiritual literature. During this time, numerous colloquia and conferences took place, attempting to delineate Teilhard's precise contributions. Jesuit institutions, in particular, hosted seminars where theologians, biologists, geologists, and philosophers engaged in lively debates. On one side, a cadre of Jesuit scientists lauded Teilhard for bridging the gap between religion and the empirical world, reminding attendees that Teilhard had spent years in the trenches of paleontological fieldwork. On the other side, traditional moral theologians insisted that Teilhard's cosmic optimism needed a stronger account of sin, grace, and salvation, as historically revealed in Christ. They questioned how his evolutionary perspective handled the gritty complexities of human depravity, or the fundamental Christian claim that salvation is a free gift, not merely a natural unfolding of potential. The best of these conferences sought to integrate such critiques, refining Teilhard's proposals and clarifying potential misunderstandings. Some participants argued that Teilhard never denied the supernatural nature of redemption, but simply placed it in a framework vast enough to encompass billions of years of pre-human history and the potential for billions more to come. The Second Vatican Council's aftermath continued to shape the atmosphere in which Teilhard's thought was received. While the Council ended in 1965, the theological transformations it unleashed played out over decades. Many Catholic theologians, Karl Rahner, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Henri de Lubac, among others, were re-examining the relationship between nature and grace, a theme central to Teilhard's synthesis. Though none of these figures fully adopted Teilhard's cosmic evolutionary model, they acknowledged the urgent need for a theology that could engage with modern cosmology, biology, and historical consciousness. In this sense, Teilhard became a symbolic forebear, an early pioneer whose bold experiments in theological integration prefigured the Council's own calls for dialogue with contemporary knowledge. Outside Catholicism, Teilhard's works continued to attract high-profile admirers. Cultural critics like Marshall McLuhan or Buckminster Fuller reference Teilhard in their analyses of media and design. McLuhan's famous global village concept paralleled Teilhard's belief that technological networks would bind humanity into a single thinking layer, although McLuhan emphasized media's capacity to reshape perception more than the mystical connotations Teilhard implied. Fuller, an architect and systems theorist, invoked Teilhard's sense of purposeful evolution to bolster his claims that humanity had the potential to achieve radical efficiency and harmony through good design and resource management. Such figures often took Teilhard's grand perspective and reworked it to address their own particular concerns, further embedding his name in interdisciplinary discourse. By the mid-1970s, Teilhard associations and study groups had proliferated, some more academically rigorous than others. The American Teilhard Association, established to promote understanding of his life and thought, organized annual gatherings where participants heard lectures on everything from cosmic Christology to quantum physics. In Europe, parallel organizations flourished, often in dialogue with Catholic universities. Certain Protestant seminaries adopted Teilhard's writings as optional or required reading for students in theology and philosophy of religion courses. While reactions varied, many professors noted that Teilhard inspired lively classroom debates. His works were dense, often poetic, occasionally perplexing, yet undeniably thought-provoking. Students wrestled with the idea that if the cosmos is truly evolving toward union with the divine, what does that suggest about our moral choices today? Is sin merely an evolutionary misstep, or is it a more radical refusal of communion? Does the cross save us from cosmic entropy, or does it reveal that entropy itself might be transformed by love? Simultaneously, the Church retained its nuanced stance. The Monitum, issued in 1962, remained in effect, cautioning the faithful about potential ambiguities in Teilhard's works. Yet, enforcement was uneven. Many bishops and theologians simply paid the warning little heed, preferring to judge for themselves. Papal addresses occasionally included remarks that, while not referencing Teilhard by name, praised efforts to integrate scientific discovery into Christian worldviews. Pope Paul VI, in particular, once spoke of the modern age's need for a deeper cosmic awareness, prompting some of Teilhard's followers to interpret it as a discreet nod in his direction. These subtle signals did not amount to a formal rehabilitation, but they contributed to an environment where Teilhard could be discussed without immediate suspicion of doctrinal error. A pivotal moment in the spread of Teilhard's ideas came with the publication of further works drawn from his unpublished writings and letters. Friends and literary executors continued to sift through his personal papers, discovering essays on topics like love energy, the feminine dimension of the cosmos, and the Eucharist as a focal point of universal convergence. Edited volumes, such as The Future of Man and Activation of Energy, appeared. Each new release fed into the public fascination. Readers glimpsed facets of Teilhard's personality that went beyond the disciplined scientist and the grand synthesizer. They discovered a man of deep emotional insight, wrestling with loneliness and longing, yearning for a world that would one day be fully transparent to God. The more intimate tone of these writings helped humanize him. Critics could still find points of contention, but it became harder to dismiss Teilhard as a detached ideologue. He emerged as a pastor of sorts, whose mystical aspirations and personal struggles were central to his theological program. The broader socio-political turmoil of the 1970s, ranging from the Vietnam War to the Cold War standoff, from oil crises to population concerns, also shaped Teilhard's reception. As dire warnings about overpopulation, resource depletion, and nuclear catastrophe gained visibility, some wondered if Teilhard's optimism about convergence was naive. What if humanity's technological might and sectarian strife led to global collapse rather than planetary unity? Did Teilhard's evolutionary framework account for the possibility of catastrophic failure? While the phenomenon of man acknowledged the real dangers of derailment, it also presumed an ultimate rising curve that would carry humanity forward, albeit through tension and struggle. This optimism rankled some critical voices who argued that Teilhard's theology did not adequately incorporate the possibility of irreversible breakdown. Others responded that Teilhard did not guarantee success. He only held that the deeper impulse of evolution pointed toward unity, but that free will could still thwart or delay it. One arena where Teilhard's ideas found a warm reception was among those exploring the intersection of science and theology in academic settings. New subfields, sometimes termed science and religion or theology and science, emerged with journals, conferences, and university programs. Teilhard was often featured as a historical touchstone, an example of how one might approach evolutionary theory with a faith perspective. Seminal works by figures like Ian Barber, Arthur Peacock, and later John Polkinghorne frequently cited Teilhard as a predecessor who recognized that a purely reductionist model of reality left out critical dimensions of human experience, meaning value and transcendence. Although these newer thinkers developed more precise methodologies, they credited Teilhard for pioneering an attempt at grand synthesis. In these circles, the phenomenon of man was read more critically, not as a definitive statement, but as a source of insight that required further refinement in light of contemporary scientific knowledge. The dialogue between Teilhard's thought and process theology added another layer to his global conversation. Process theologians, influenced by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, viewed God and the world as engaged in a co-creative relationship, with reality unfolding in temporal processes. They championed a vision of God who experiences the world dynamically, not as a distant omnipotent ruler, but as a relational presence co-suffering and co-evolving with creation. Some process thinkers found affinities with Teilhard's notion of God, drawing the cosmos forward through the incarnate Christ Omega. Yet they also critiqued his emphasis on a seemingly fixed endpoint, arguing that Whitehead's philosophy posited an open future with no guaranteed finale. The interplay between Teilhard's teleology and process theology's emphasis on open-ended becoming led to fruitful discussions about the nature of eschatology, free will, and divine agency. While neither side embraced the other's system entirely, they recognized a shared desire to interpret Christian faith in a universe that was dynamic, relational, and ongoing. Such theological exploration, however, did not shield Teilhard's reputation from periodic eruptions of criticism within Catholic forums. Traditionalists, especially those unsettled by the changes of Vatican II, saw Teilhard as an emblem of what they perceived as modernist infiltration, an attempt to dilute the timeless truths of the faith with progressive ideas. They pointed to his non-literal reading of Genesis, his willingness to incorporate modern cosmology, and his cosmic Christology as evidence of doctrinal compromise. In pamphlets and articles, some conservative Catholics insisted that Teilhard's theology undermined the dogma of original sin by rejecting a strict historical couple at the dawn of humanity. Teilhard's supporters responded that the Church itself, in official documents following Pope Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis, had conceded the possibility of polygenism, the idea of multiple human ancestors, and did not insist on a literalistic interpretation of Eden. Instead, they argued that Teilhard's approach was consonant with deeper scriptural truths about the universal fall of humankind, even if expressed in evolutionary language. This tug-of-war often played out behind the scenes in seminaries and bishop conferences, with individual professors or clergy deciding how much emphasis to place on Teilhard. In some regions, he was celebrated as a saintly figure whose intellectual boldness represented the best of Jesuit innovation. In others, his name was taboo, evoking half-remembered controversies. Yet, as the 1970s drew to a close, there was a noticeable shift. Newer generations of Catholics grew up with far less fear of modern science. The concept of deep geological time and the fact of biological evolution were now widely accepted, even among many devout believers. Teilhard, once radical, began to feel almost mainstream in the sense that most educated Catholics no longer saw an inherent clash between Darwin and Genesis. The question was not whether evolution happened, but how it fit into salvation history. In that evolving landscape, Teilhard's cosmic vision seemed less threatening and more prescient. By the early 1980s, Teilhard's works were available in multiple translations, including Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and Japanese, among others. His appeal in Latin America intersected in complex ways with liberation theology. While not addressing socio-political oppression directly, Teilhard's emphasis on communal growth toward unity did resonate with themes of collective action and the transformation of earthly realities. Some liberation theologians argued that Teilhard's cosmic horizon could deepen an otherwise purely political revolution, suggesting that the true liberation of humanity must encompass spiritual and ecological dimensions. Meanwhile, in Asia, Catholic intellectuals found in Teilhard's approach a useful bridge for conversations with Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism. Ideas of interconnectedness, cosmic unfolding, and the primacy of consciousness struck chords in Eastern traditions, though the specifically Christocentric dimension set Teilhard's vision apart. This global conversation around Teilhard was further amplified by a wave of spiritual autobiographies and commentaries published by those who had encountered his work at pivotal moments in their own development. Some recounted how, as young scientists, they had nearly lost their faith upon learning about evolution, only to find in Teilhard a way to see Darwin's insights not as threats, but as revelations of a divine plan. Others spoke of a midlife transformation triggered by Teilhard's conviction that every part of our daily lives, our jobs, our families, our creativity, participates in a cosmic liturgy. These personal testimonies, often published in religious magazines or small presses, gave Teilhard's thought a testimonial authority that academic critiques could not easily dismiss. They showed that, whatever the philosophical or theological disputes, Teilhard's writings had the power to inspire devotion, resilience, and renewed commitment to social and ecological responsibility. Yet even as Teilhard's star continued to rise, not everyone joined the chorus of admiration. A fresh wave of scientific critiques emerged from scholars who had read more recent evolutionary biology and found little support for a universal drive toward complexity. The influential paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould famously argued that evolution is more about contingency than directionality, a series of historical accidents rather than a cosmic ladder. From this viewpoint, consciousness might be an extraordinary happenstance, not the inevitable apex of a grand plan. Gould acknowledged that Teilhard's personal role in the discovery of Peking man was scientifically important, but he questioned whether Teilhard's teleological stance simply reflected his religious convictions rather than the impartial findings of science. Advocates for Teilhard responded that he never claimed to be doing science alone, but rather a synthetic vision that integrated science, philosophy, and theology. The debate underscored the perennial question of whether Teilhard's brand of evolutionary mysticism overreached, conflating empirical data with metaphysical hope. Similar discussions occurred in philosophical circles grappling with existentialism and postmodernism. Thinkers like Sartre and Camus, earlier in the century, had painted a picture of an indifferent universe devoid of inherent meaning. Postmodern critiques further fragmented grand narratives, questioning whether any overarching story, cosmic or otherwise, could be trusted. Teilhard's sweeping meta-narrative seemed a prime example of what postmodern theorists called a totalizing discourse, imposing unity where there might be only chaos and multiplicity. From a postmodern vantage, Teilhard's confidence in an omega point raised red flags. Could this be just another hegemonic claim to universal truth? Yet for those weary of postmodern fragmentation, Teilhard's cosmic scale offered a counterpoint, insisting that the universe's evolution was not an arbitrary drift, but a purposeful dance culminating in love. This tension between postmodern skepticism and Teilhardian synthesis added a new facet to the ongoing conversation, placing him in dialogue with the most challenging philosophical currents of the late 20th century. By the mid-1980s, the name Teilhard had become something of a cultural touchstone, emblematic of an audacious attempt to unify science and faith under a single banner. References to him appeared in sermons, environmental manifestos, futuristic speculations about technology, and even political speeches that invoked the promise of global unity. Perhaps inevitably, such widespread appropriation led to simplifications and distortions of his thought. Popularizers sometimes reduced Teilhard to a handful of slogans. Everything that rises must converge. We are moving toward Omega. We are all immersed in a divine milieu, without grappling with the rigorous philosophical and theological underpinnings. Those who had studied Teilhard in depth lamented these oversimplifications, but they also recognized that the broad cultural engagement suggested a deep hunger for exactly the kind of hope and coherence his vision provided. In academic theology, a handful of dissertations were written that tried to update Teilhard in light of new developments in cosmology. The discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation in 1964 and subsequent refinements to Big Bang theory had confirmed the universe's age and expansion rate with far greater precision than Teilhard had known in his lifetime. Some theologians suggested that Teilhard's teleological perspective could be reconciled with the standard cosmological model if one interpreted the directionality not as an inevitable upward arc in every aspect of matter, but as a broader emergent property of a universe with certain physical constants and laws. Others probed quantum theory's implications for consciousness, wondering if Teilhard's within of things, his insistence that matter carries an interiority, found an unexpected corollary in the observer-dependent phenomena described in quantum mechanics. While Teilhard himself had never written on quantum physics in any detail, his basic hunch that mind and matter are intimately entwined opened the door to creative theological speculation. As the 1980s gave way to the early 1990s, Teilhard's presence on the global stage was firmly established. The controversies and cautions remained, yet so did the devotees and explorers who saw him as a wellspring of insight. In Catholic universities, courses dedicated to his thought multiplied, drawing students who were intrigued by the possibility of a cosmic Christ. In mainline Protestant seminaries, professors used Teilhard as a comparative resource, placing him alongside Whitehead, Bonhoeffer, or Moltmann to illustrate different modes of 20th century theology. Non-Christian audiences, too, continued to parse Teilhard's work, sometimes extracting universal philosophical insights about unity, complexity, and convergence that they then applied to their own religious or secular frameworks. Throughout this global conversation, Teilhard's voice remained a paradoxical blend of scientific evidence and mystical poetry. He had written as both a paleontologist and a priest, convinced that the spiritual dimension was not a superimposed fantasy, but an intrinsic aspect of the evolutionary process, like a seed latent within matter, waiting to unfold. This conviction appealed to those searching for a middle path between materialism and supernaturalism, between a world explained solely by physics and chemistry and one confined within a doctrinal religious literalism. Teilhard offered a cosmic Catholicism, thoroughly sacramental, deeply incarnational, yet relentlessly oriented toward the future. His spirituality revolved around the Eucharist as a divine milieu, a liturgical action that prefigured the ultimate union of all creation in God. By the end of the 1980s, it was clear that Teilhard's influence extended well beyond his own Roman Catholic tradition, bridging denominational lines, crossing into secular scholarship, and permeating popular spirituality. He had become a truly global figure, a man whose ideas were championed by ecology-minded pastors in Latin America, by progressive Anglican thinkers in England, by New Age enthusiasts in California, by Catholic scientists in France, and by seekers of interfaith dialogue in East Asia. Each group found something in his thought, a spark that lit their imaginations about humanity's unfolding story. The controversies were hardly resolved. Indeed, they would persist for decades. But Teilhard's name signaled a direction, a possibility that evolution and faith, rather than clashing endlessly, might together point to a horizon of unimaginable depth and grandeur. In this sense, Episode 5 of Teilhard's unfolding legacy is one of globalization and cross-pollination. The war-torn world into which Teilhard's writings first appeared had changed drastically, now knit together by mass media, multinational organizations, and a dawning recognition of planetary interdependence. Teilhard stood as a prophet of that interdependence, insisting that the future demanded a higher level of consciousness and unity, a threshold no longer optional, but necessary. Whether or not one agreed with every aspect of his cosmic Christology, it was difficult to ignore his prescience about the challenges and opportunities of a world in which humans seemed bound together for better or worse. Thus, as the 1990s approached, Teilhard's voice continued to echo across ecclesiastical, academic, and cultural arenas, weaving a narrative that countless readers still found compelling, that the universe was unfolding in Christ toward a final convergence, an omega point where matter and spirit, earth and heaven, time and eternity would be reconciled in love. Episode 6, Enduring Relevance and the Ongoing Synthesis. By the dawn of the 1990s, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin had secured his place as one of the 20th century's most influential and controversial Catholic thinkers. Yet his legacy was far from settled. The world was on the cusp of massive transformations. The end of the Cold War, the explosion of digital technology, a new wave of globalization, and escalating ecological crises. In many ways, these developments seem to crystallize the very issues Teilhard had wrestled with: planetary unity, the rise of a global consciousness, and the moral imperative to direct human energy toward constructive ends. As the last decade of the century unfolded, and as the new millennium approached, Teilhard's voice continued to inspire, provoke, and sometimes perplex those who encountered his writings. More than ever, the question arose: how might this French Jesuit from an earlier era speak to the urgent concerns of a rapidly changing world? One of the clearest signs of Teilhard's enduring relevance lay in the burgeoning field of environmental ethics, which gained academic and cultural prominence in the 1990s. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and deforestation loomed large in public discourse, prompting theologians and ethicists to seek robust frameworks for a planetary care ethic. Teilhard's emphasis on the inherent worth of matter, on creation as a single evolving tapestry, seemed tailor-made for such reflection. Many eco-theologians drew from Teilhard's cosmic mysticism to affirm that the Earth was not a mere resource to be exploited, but a sacred milieu undergoing transformation in tandem with human consciousness. Creation theology found new energy in Teilhard's idea that every atom, every living cell, participates in a cosmic communion that awaits fulfillment in Christ. This perspective underscored the grave responsibility humans bore as the most self-reflective species, a vantage point that might either cooperate with or obstruct the planet's forward movement. Some theologians, however, pressed Teilhard's ecological interpreters to attend more closely to the darker side of evolution: its extinctions, random mutations, predatory cycles, and the pervasive reality of suffering. Was Teilhard too quick to celebrate the upward march of complexity without fully addressing nature's cruelty and pain? From an evolutionary standpoint, ecosystems thrive on competition as well as cooperation, and the constant churn of life and death is hardly comforting. Teilhard had, indeed, acknowledged the presence of suffering and even described the cross of Christ as embedded in the heart of that struggle, but critics felt he had not developed a theodicy robust enough for an age increasingly aware of mass extinctions. In response, eco-theologians sympathetic to Teilhard began to supplement his vision with insights from process theology, feminist theology, and post-colonial critiques, collectively striving to craft a deeper cosmic theology that would integrate both wonder and lament, both ecological praise and ecological grief. In parallel with these theological expansions, Teilhard also found renewed attention in discussions about the rapidly evolving digital world. The concept of the noosphere, a thinking layer encompassing the Earth, felt astonishingly prescient in the Internet age. With the rise of personal computers, the World Wide Web, and email communication, many saw the literal emergence of a global brain, connecting individuals in ways unimaginable even a few decades earlier. Teilhard's devotees claimed that this was precisely what he had prophesied: the intensification of collective consciousness through technological and cultural links. Yet, here again, critiques abounded. Was the Internet truly fostering a deeper unity, or was it amplifying division and misinformation? Teilhard had warned that technology alone could not guarantee moral convergence. Human hearts and wills must freely align in love. Without ethical and spiritual grounding, the digital realm could easily fragment humanity into echo chambers or facilitate destructive behaviors. This concern did not prevent technology visionaries from embracing Teilhard's ideas. Figures in Silicon Valley and related tech hubs occasionally invoke Teilhard to describe the potential of global connectivity, evoking the dream of a peaceful, unified planet underpinned by information sharing. Others proposed that artificial intelligence might represent a new frontier in the evolution of consciousness, raising Teilhardian questions about whether machines could ever partake in the spiritual dimension of the noosphere. Teilhard himself, of course, had never addressed AI explicitly, but his conviction that evolution could spawn radically new forms of organization and complexity led some enthusiasts to wonder, if consciousness is an emergent property of complex systems, might it emerge in artificial systems as well? More orthodox interpreters cautioned that Teilhard always grounded consciousness in the divine source, not merely in material complexity, thus leaving open the question of whether a truly self-aware AI could integrate into the Christic dimension he championed. Alongside these futuristic debates, Teilhard's standing within the Roman Catholic Church remained at once celebrated and delicately unconfirmed. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI offered more nuanced reflections on evolution, signaling a willingness to engage with modern science beyond the older polemics. John Paul II famously addressed the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1996, stating that evolution was more than a hypothesis and emphasizing the compatibility between faith and evolutionary theory. Some Teilhardian scholars read this as a long-delayed but real vindication of Teilhard's core stance. Yet the papacy did not explicitly lift the 1962 Manitum or declare Teilhard's writings free from all ambiguity. Vatican pronouncements often remain general, sidestepping Teilhard's distinctive language about the omega point or the noosphere. Still, many believed that the general shift in the Church's approach to science and theology indirectly validated Teilhard's lifelong efforts. During this period, a series of high-level Catholic theologians, including Cardinals Henri de Lubac, earlier, and Christoph Schönborn, later, offered nuanced takes on Teilhard. De Lubac had long been a friend and admirer, though he pointed out the need for clearer articulation of certain doctrines. Schönborn, who edited the Catechism of the Catholic Church, underscored the importance of creation's openness to God, but maintained a traditional line on issues of sin and redemption. Even if these theologians did not wholeheartedly adopt Teilhard's system, they recognized him as a thinker who had tackled the crucial question of how revelation interacts with an evolving universe. By the turn of the millennium, it was common for Catholic universities to include some discussion of Teilhard in courses on modern theology, even if the official status of his thought remained unresolved. Meanwhile, in academic theology at large, Teilhard's oeuvre continued to inspire new readings and reinterpretations. In the 1990s and early 2000s, feminist theologians revisited Teilhard's emphasis on love energy, finding in his work hints of a more relational, interdependent understanding of salvation. Some argued that Teilhard's cosmic view could be made more inclusive if one foregrounded the experiences of women, indigenous peoples, and oppressed communities who often suffered the negative externalities of technological progress. They appreciated Teilhard's conviction that evolution was not simply about dominion, but about communion, though they also criticized him for rarely addressing the entrenched patriarchal structures of his own day. In their adaptations, they expanded the cosmic Christ to include a more explicit affirmation of bodily, cultural, and gender diversity, aligning Teilhard's universal outlook with concerns of social justice and equality. Post-colonial theologians also engaged Teilhard, sometimes ambivalently. They saw his hope for a unified human future as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it could serve as a theological rationale for global solidarity and mutual respect. On the other, they worried that unity might be interpreted as Western cultural hegemony if not carefully critiqued. Teilhard had been a product of European culture, shaped by colonial-era attitudes he might never have fully interrogated. Did his cosmic unity leave room for plural ways of being human, or did it risk homogenizing cultural differences in the name of convergence? The best post-colonial readings of Teilhard grappled with such questions, acknowledging that while his theology offered a potent antidote to narrow nationalism, it also needed a contextual approach that honored the many forms of human identity and spirituality emerging from formerly colonized regions. As the world entered the early 2000s, climate change concerns escalated, and global forums such as the Earth Summits and United Nations climate conferences became focal points of international politics. Teilhard's name surfaced in certain ecological circles that saw him as an intellectual ancestor of the integral ecology movement, an approach that combined concern for the environment with broader ethical, social, and spiritual dimensions. Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si invoked the language of integral ecology and underscored humanity's role in caring for our common home. Though the encyclical did not mention Teilhard directly, many theologians reading it heard Teilhard's resonance. Francis spoke of the interconnection of all creatures and the cosmic dimension of Christ's redemptive act, a theme that Teilhard had championed decades earlier. Some commentators postulated that the spirit of Laudato Si stood in an implicit lineage with Teilhard's cosmic theology, bridging the gap between Catholic social teaching and the urgent demands of planetary stewardship. Simultaneously, in the realm of secular thought, Teilhard's ideas continued to pop up in discussions about complexity theory and the emergent paradigms in science. Researchers studying self-organizing systems, whether in biology or economics, occasionally cited Teilhard as someone who had anticipated the concept that higher-level order could arise spontaneously from simpler interactions. Granted, Teilhard's teleological outlook did not fit neatly with the more probabilistic or algorithmic models of complexity science, but the parallels were intriguing enough to spark dialogue. Some complexity theorists suggested that Teilhard's within of things might be reinterpreted as emergent interiority, a philosophical stance acknowledging that consciousness or meaning emerges at certain thresholds of complexity. While these scientists might not adopt Teilhard's Christological endpoint, they found his vision stimulating for exploring the mysteries of evolution, consciousness, and social organization on large scales. In popular culture, references to Teilhard continued to appear in unexpected places. Musicians, poets, and filmmakers wove quotations from the phenomenon of man into their works, often highlighting his lyrical celebrations of unity and love. Spiritual retreat centers devoted entire programs to exploring Teilhard's universe, guiding participants through meditations on cosmic time, personal transformation, and the Eucharistic presence in creation. For many seekers, Teilhard provided a sense of awe that was at once scientific and sacramental. The story of cosmic evolution felt incomplete without a deep spiritual dimension, and Teilhard had offered a template for integrating both. Though some interpreters presented a domesticated version of his theology, missing the nuances of his Christ-centered eschatology, their enthusiasm testified to Teilhard's ongoing capacity to ignite spiritual imagination. In the academic sphere, the constant refrain from critics remained. Was Teilhard's sweeping narrative too grand, too totalizing, and lacking in empirical backing? They pointed to the absence of peer-reviewed scientific studies supporting a law of increasing complexity, leading inexorably to consciousness. They also noted that Teilhard, for all his genuine expertise in paleontology, wrote long before many of the genetic and molecular discoveries of the late 20th century, and thus his grasp of evolutionary mechanisms was dated. From a purely scientific standpoint, these critics argued there was no guarantee that life on other planets, if it existed at all, would follow the same path, or that consciousness must continue to intensify indefinitely. Teilhard's defenders replied that his project was never restricted to science alone. It was a philosophical and theological meditation on the data that science provided, interpreted in light of Christian revelation. They likened him to a modern church father, someone less interested in verifying each scientific claim than in discerning the deeper meaning behind the unfolding cosmic drama. As the 2010s arrived, Teilhard's name showed little sign of fading. On the contrary, with every new challenge confronting humanity, pandemics, geopolitical tensions, digital revolutions, climate emergencies, his thesis that we must converge or perish felt increasingly relevant. If technology and globalization knit humanity ever closer, then we faced a stark choice. Either harness these forces for a collective good rooted in moral and spiritual vision, or let them exacerbate inequality, violence, and ecological devastation. The stakes of Teilhard's question had never been higher. Would the planet's thinking layer unify in love or devolve into discord? Scholars and activists who invoked Teilhard spoke of the possibility that the evolutionary process was approaching a critical juncture, a threshold beyond which a new level of planetary consciousness might or might not emerge. This narrative of a threshold echoed Teilhard's own language about hominization, the transformative moment when reflective thought was born in humanity. Now, the question was whether a second transformation, often termed planetization in Teilhardian circles, might be at hand. Teilhard had believed this transition might be spurred by crises that forced humanity to recognize its interdependence. His writings about the forging of unity through suffering gained renewed attention as catastrophes, whether political, environmental, or epidemiological, underscored how intimately connected modern societies had become. Some found hope in Teilhard's conviction that love was the driving energy of evolution, capable of transcending conflict and forging unity in diversity. Others insisted his optimism required clearer socio-political strategies to ensure that unity did not become a mask for domination or an excuse for ignoring local cultures. By the mid-2010s, an entire new generation encountered Teilhard for the first time, often through the lens of ecological spirituality or digital culture. Conferences, lectures, and online forums debated how best to reinterpret his key ideas. Some younger Catholics, intrigued by Laudato Si and Pope Francis's inclusive style, rediscovered Teilhard as an intellectual grandfather figure, bridging the Church's sacramental theology with an activist concern for the common good. Meanwhile, outside the Church, Teilhard maintained a foothold among spiritual seekers who drew from multiple traditions. The universal scope of his vision, his emphasis on cosmic consciousness, appealed to those forging syncretic or post-institutional paths. Thus, by the second decade of the 21st century, Teilhard occupied a paradoxical spot. A revered pioneer, widely cited, yet still not officially canonized by the Church he served. A scientist respected for his paleontological contributions, yet often challenged for conflating evolutionary biology with theology. A mystic whose cosmic language captured the imagination, yet whose Christocentric anchor continued to perplex or alienate those committed to purely secular frames. It seemed that the controversies surrounding Teilhard's life and work could not be fully resolved without either diminishing the grandeur of his vision or dismissing the complexities of his Church's doctrine. Yet that unresolved status might well have been Teilhard's greatest strength. His entire theology was oriented toward the idea of tension. Tension that drives evolution upward, tension that sparks new synthesis, tension that compels love to overcome division. In a world marked by polarities, science versus religion, reason versus faith, nature versus grace, Teilhard stood as a figure who refused to choose sides. He insisted that the fullest truth lay in a creative union that transcended such binaries. This refusal to oversimplify made him a perennial lightning rod. Critics could latch onto his ambiguities, while admirers celebrated his openness. In effect, Teilhard became a symbol of the painstaking work required to hold disparate elements together, trusting that in their union lay a deeper secret of the cosmos, the incarnate logos, drawing all things into a final harmony. As the third decade of the new millennium began, Teilhard's thought remained a fixture in discussions at the intersection of theology, ecology, technology, and global ethics. New challenges, such as the accelerating pace of climate disruption and the potential for artificial superintelligence, only heightened the sense that humanity stood at a crossroads, a moment reminiscent of Teilhard's own prescient warnings and hopes. Whether or not one accepted his specific formulations, it was difficult to deny the resonance of his core question: how to align the explosive powers of evolution, now manipulated by human hands, with the spiritual and moral impetus that alone can guide them toward unity rather than annihilation. Thus, Episode 6 of Teilhard's story is not so much a conclusion as a vantage point, gazing across the arc of his posthumous influence into the present day. More than 60 years after his death, Teilhard remains a vital intellectual and spiritual presence. His bold cosmic framework continues to spur debate, fueling new syntheses and eliciting renewed critiques. In the final analysis, Teilhard's lasting contribution may rest in his refusal to compartmentalize. He integrated geology, paleontology, cosmology, anthropology, theology, mysticism, and ethics into one sweeping narrative. Though that narrative may prove too large or too bold for some, it stands as a testament to the human longing for coherence, for a story in which matter's restless unfolding finds fulfillment in spirit, and where the Christ event is not an isolated incursion, but the culmination of cosmic destiny. For those who share that longing, Teilhard remains a guide and an inspiration, reminding the world that evolution, properly understood, is not an enemy of faith, but a stage for the most profound drama of all, the ongoing creation and redemption of a universe drawn by love toward the omega point, where God is all in all. Even now, as new scientific discoveries emerge and global crises intensify, Teilhard's call resonates. Remain true to the grand curve of cosmic evolution, and in the face of all challenges, keep your eyes fixed on the ultimate convergence of hearts and minds in Christ. He spoke as a Jesuit, a geologist, a mystic, and a priest who had walked through the horrors of war and the exhilaration of scientific exploration. That synthesis, forged through personal obedience and intellectual daring, still captures imaginations and stirs consciences around the world. If the measure of a thinker's greatness is the extent to which their ideas continue to spark fresh insight and debate, then Teilhard de Chardin has surely secured his place among the most significant Catholic voices of modern times. His biography, with its 6 episodes of searching and synthesis, is not merely a historical chronicle, but an invitation to see creation anew, to embrace the cosmic dimensions of Christ's love, and to collaborate in the evolution of a world still coming to know its creator from within. And thus we leave Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, where he lived most passionately, at the crossroads of faith and science, of matter and spirit, urging humanity onward toward a future in which evolution and grace are not strangers but converging streams, streams that, if met with open hearts, may yet carry us all to the threshold of the divine.